The Harpers Ferry remains case began with the discovery of a body in 1996 and revealed a web of deceit, financial exploitation, and ultimately murder. On May 13, 1996, at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in Loudoun County, Virginia, a park ranger noticed an unusual steamer trunk near the entrance to the park. The trunk was positioned next to a trash can along the road leading into the park. At first glance, it appeared to be discarded junk. The ranger, who was at the end of their shift and without a radio to communicate, decided to leave the inspection for another time, assuming it wasn't an urgent matter. This decision delayed the discovery of its gruesome contents by a full day. The following morning, another park ranger came across the same trunk. It being covered in strips of duct tape immediately raised suspicion. The ranger decided to investigate further and began cutting away at the tape sealing the trunk. Upon opening it, they found an oddly shaped duffel bag inside. As they unzipped this bag, they discovered yet another duffel bag nested within it. The second bag contained soiled clothing, which seemed pretty harmless at first. However, as the rangers sifted through the clothing, they made a horrifying discovery: a human hand tucked among the items. Shocked by this find, the ranger immediately stopped their search and contacted local law enforcement. When investigators arrived at the scene, they carefully examined the trunk and its contents. Inside, they found the emaciated body of an elderly man folded unnaturally into the cramped space of the steamer trunk. The victim's position suggested that significant effort had been made to fit him into such a confined area. The man appeared disheveled and unshaven, with only a pajama top covering his body. A pillowcase had been placed over his head, adding to the disturbing nature of the discovery. The condition of the body provided few immediate clues about the victim's identity or circumstances surrounding his death. The lack of identification with the remains complicated efforts to determine who he was or why he had been left in such a manner. Law enforcement transported the body to a morgue for further examination in hopes of uncovering more details. The autopsy revealed critical information about both the victim's physical condition and cause of death. The man was determined to be approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed only 111 pounds, an indication of severe emaciation at the time of his death. His age was estimated to be between his mid-60s and mid-70s. These findings suggested that he may have been in poor health or neglected in his final days. The medical examiner concluded that strangulation was the primary cause of death. Additionally, there were signs of blunt force trauma to the back of his head, which may have occurred either during or shortly before his murder. Toxicology reports revealed high levels of sedatives and tranquilizers in his system, indicating that he had likely been drugged prior to being killed. This combination of factors pointed to foul play rather than natural causes or accidental death. Further analysis suggested that the victim had died no more than 2 days before his body was discovered in the park. These findings narrowed down the timeline for investigators but provided little else in terms of leads. At first, investigators speculated that the victim might have been under someone's care before his death, possibly in a private home or care facility where he could have been neglected or mistreated. The presence of sedatives in his system led them to consider whether a caretaker or nurse might have been involved in his death. Police theorized that whoever killed him viewed him as a burden and sought to dispose of his body in an untraceable way. The location where the trunk was abandoned also raised questions. Harpers Ferry National Historical Park is a popular area with significant foot traffic due to its historical significance and scenic trails. Leaving such an incriminating item in such a public place seemed both brazen and desperate, a potential sign that the killer had panicked or lacked better options for disposing of evidence. Despite these early theories, investigators faced significant challenges in identifying both the victim and any potential suspects. The lack of identification on or near the body meant they had no immediate way of determining who he was or connecting him to any known missing persons cases. Without this crucial piece of information, their investigation stalled. For 7 years following the discovery of the body, authorities struggled to determine who the elderly man was. It was not until January 2003 that investigators finally identified the man as Jasper Jack Watkins through fingerprint analysis and military records, unraveling years of mystery surrounding his death and setting the stage for justice. Watkins was 76 years old at the time of his murder and had been estranged from his family for years. Born into a large family, he had served as a medic during World War II before transitioning into other roles within the military, including helicopter pilot and flight instructor during the Vietnam War. He earned numerous accolades for his service, including 6 Purple Hearts and the Vietnam Medal of Valor. After retiring from the Army, Watkins worked as a helicopter pilot for various companies before eventually settling into retirement. Despite his distinguished career and contributions to his country, Watkins' later years were marked by isolation and vulnerability. He became distant from his children and other family members following personal struggles and relocations after the death of his wife. This separation made him an easy target for exploitation by a woman named Nancy Siegel, who entered his life under seemingly benign circumstances, but ultimately orchestrated events leading to his tragic demise. Nancy was no stranger to fraudulent schemes by the time she met Jack Watkins. Born Nancy Schweitzer in 1948, she grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. Her early life was marked by instability. Her father raised her after her mother abandoned the family, but he was tragically killed outside a bar when she was just 16 years old. Despite this difficult upbringing, Nancy's adult life became defined by manipulation and financial exploitation. Her fraudulent activities began as early as her first marriage in 1968. She married Charles Kucharski and soon began taking out loans and credit cards in his name without his knowledge. Her gambling habits exacerbated the financial strain on the marriage, and when they divorced in 1985, Charles was left with over $100K in debt tied to her fraudulent activities. Unfazed by the consequences of her actions, Nancy repeated this pattern with her second husband, Ted Giesendorfer, whom she married later that same year. Once again, she opened credit accounts using his personal information without his consent. By the time they divorced in 1993, Ted was saddled with over $18,000 in debt. Nancy's fraudulent schemes extended beyond her husband's to include her own children. She used the identities of both her daughters to open credit accounts without their knowledge and directed statements for these accounts to addresses she controlled. This destroyed their credit ratings and left them financially crippled. Additionally, between 1992 and 1994, Nancy targeted other romantic partners and acquaintances for financial gain. She often gained access to their mail or personal information under false pretenses and redirected their financial statements to her residence. These schemes allowed her to accumulate tens of thousands of dollars in debt under their names while avoiding detection. Fast forward to November 21st, 1994, Nancy met Jack when he purchased burial services for his recently deceased wife. Jack was a widower nearly 30 years older than Nancy and lived a modest but comfortable life supported by Social Security benefits and retirement annuity payments from New York Life Insurance Company. Before meeting Nancy, Jack had no debts. He owned his home outright and maintained only a few credit cards that he used sparingly. Nancy quickly ingratiated herself into Jack's life by presenting herself as a caring companion during his time of grief. Their relationship developed rapidly into what appeared to be a romantic partnership. Both described each other as fiancés to friends and acquaintances. However, Nancy's intentions were far from genuine. Within months of meeting Jack, Nancy began systematically exploiting him financially. By December 1994, just weeks after they met, she had gained access to his existing credit accounts and began making extensive charges for personal items such as jewelry and clothing. She also changed the mailing addresses on these accounts to her own residence in Ellicott City, Maryland, ensuring that Jack would not receive statements or notices about the mounting debts. By August 1995, Nancy had accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in debt under Jack's name. She persuaded him to take out a $44,000 mortgage on his home under the pretense that it would help pay off existing debts. Instead of resolving these financial issues, Nancy used the funds for new purchases while continuing to rack up additional debt on credit cards issued in Jack's name. In November 1995, Nancy convinced Jack to refinance his home again and give her $20,000 from the proceeds. She promised him that the money would be used to purchase a condominium where they could live together after their marriage. However, this promise was another fabrication. Instead, Nancy used the money for personal expenses while maintaining control over Jack's finances. Furthermore, Nancy's manipulation extended beyond financial exploitation. She also worked to isolate Jack from his social network. Before meeting Nancy, Jack regularly had breakfast with friends and maintained contact with stepchildren from a previous marriage. After becoming involved with Nancy, these interactions diminished significantly. She eventually drove him to one final breakfast where he said goodbye to his friends, a calculated move that severed his ties with people who might have intervened on his behalf. Nancy also intercepted phone calls from Jack's stepchildren by forwarding them to her own number without his knowledge. This further isolated him from potential sources of support or assistance. By early 1996, Jack's assets were nearly depleted due to Nancy's relentless exploitation. In April of the same year, she sold his home without his consent and attempted to have him wrongfully committed to a psychiatric facility by claiming he suffered from dementia. When no long-term care facility had immediate availability, Nancy brought Jack back to her condo upon his discharge from the hospital on April 16, 1996. Less than a month later, in the middle of May, she murdered him. On the night of the murder, which is said to have either been on May 13th or 14th, Nancy used a manual strangulation to kill Jack. The autopsy revealed cervical compression as the cause of death, with corresponding abrasions and subcutaneous hemorrhages on his neck consistent with strangulation. Additionally, there were fresh cuts and abrasions on Jack's body, as well as blunt force trauma to the back of his head. These injuries suggest that a violent struggle may have occurred before Nancy overpowered him. The toxicology analysis also showed toxic levels of sedatives in Jack's system at the time of his death. It is likely that Nancy administered these drugs shortly before killing him to incapacitate him further and reduce resistance. After murdering Jack, Nancy faced the challenge of disposing of his body in a way that would prevent identification and delay any investigation into his disappearance. She decided to stuff his emaciated body into 2 duffel bags before placing them inside a large steamer trunk. The next day, Nancy drove from Maryland to Loudoun County, Virginia, with the trunk containing Jack's remains in her vehicle. She chose a remote location near an access point to the Appalachian Trail along Route 340, which she believed wasn't heavily monitored. There, she abandoned the trunk next to a trash can under cover of darkness between approximately 8:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. Afterward, Nancy continued using Jack's identity for financial gain. She redirected his social security checks and retirement annuity payments totaling over $89,000 to herself by changing their mailing addresses first to her residence in Ellicott City and later to a P.O. box under her control. In addition to stealing these funds, Nancy opened new credit accounts using Jack's personal information while continuing to use existing accounts she had already exploited during their relationship. Nancy never reported Jack missing or raised any concerns about his whereabouts following his murder. Because he had become estranged from much of his family by this time, and due to her efforts at isolating him, no one else reported him missing either. In early 2003, federal agents began surveilling Nancy after noticing irregularities in Jack's social security checks. They observed Nancy retrieving mail from the post office box where Jack's checks were being sent. Investigators also interviewed her daughters, Amanda and Jennifer, who revealed that their mother had occasionally deposited Jack's checks into their bank accounts without explanation. During these interviews, Amanda recognized the steamer trunk in which Jack's body had been found as one that had previously belonged to their family. She identified it by distinctive nail polish stains on its surface. In mid-2003, postal inspectors and FBI agents set up a sting operation to confront Nancy. They approached her at a post office in Ellicott City, Maryland, shortly after she retrieved one of Jack's checks from her P.O. box. Calmly agreeing to an interview, Nancy initially claimed that Jack was alive and living in Pennsylvania with a woman named Ruth. She stated that she had continued cashing his checks because he was a gambler who could not manage his own finances. When investigators pressed her further and revealed that they knew Jack had been dead since 1996, Nancy changed her story. She claimed she had found him dead in her home one day in May 1996, suggesting he had taken his own life. According to Nancy, she panicked upon discovering his body and decided not to call authorities out of fear that she would be implicated in his death. Instead, she claimed she cut him down from where he was suspended, placed him in duffel bags, and then into the trunk before dumping it near the park. Investigators found this account implausible. Despite her denials of involvement in Jack's murder, Nancy admitted during questioning that she had used his social security benefits after his death, but insisted it was only because he trusted her to manage his finances. On January 16, 2004, federal authorities indicted Nancy for multiple offenses related to Jack's murder and the financial fraud she committed both before and after his death. The charges included second-degree murder for killing Jack Watkins, witness tampering for murdering him to prevent him from reporting her fraudulent activities, theft of government benefits for cashing nearly $90,000 worth of Social Security checks, identity theft for using Jack's personal information after his death, mail fraud and wire fraud related to her use of fraudulent credit accounts, and transporting a body across state lines to impede an official investigation. The case of Melissa K. Monday, often referred to as Missy and Jerry Strickland, is a tragic story of manipulation and crime. It unfolded in the mid-1980s, capturing national attention due to its shocking nature and the role media played in solving it. Melissa's life before 1986 was by all means pretty normal growing up in Maryland. She was an honors student, a member of the Future Homemakers of America, and deeply involved in school, church, and other extracurricular activities. Her upbringing seemed stable, and she was known for being a diligent and responsible young woman. However, her life took a dramatic turn when she met Jerry Strickland, a man 10 years older than her with a troubled past. Jerry entered Melissa's family's life under false pretenses. He approached them with the claim that he was interested in purchasing property to convert into an orphanage. This seemingly noble intention masked his true character as a manipulative individual with a criminal history. While Phyllis, Melissa's mother, was wary of Jerry from the outset, Melissa herself was quickly drawn to him. Jerry lavished attention on the 15-year-old girl, something she reportedly felt was lacking in her home life. This attention created an emotional bond that would lead Melissa down a dangerous path. By April 1986, Melissa had become so enamored with Jerry that she decided to run away with him. The pair left Maryland and relocated to Michigan, where they began living as a couple despite their significant age difference. The relationship quickly became more serious. Within a short time, Melissa gave birth to their first child. This new chapter in her life marked the beginning of her descent into circumstances that would ultimately lead to tragedy. In Michigan, Melissa found work as an assistant manager at a Union 76 gas station. It was here that she encountered Elmer DeBoer, an oil company courier whose job involved collecting cash receipts from local gas stations. Elmer struck up a friendship with Melissa during his regular visits to the station. Unbeknownst to him, this seemingly innocent connection would later make him the target of a deadly scheme orchestrated by Jerry. Jerry's influence over Melissa grew more pronounced during this period. He had already demonstrated his ability to manipulate her emotions and decisions, and he now began involving her in his criminal plans. He devised a plot to rob Elmer during one of his routine cash pickups at the gas station where Melissa worked. The plan hinged on Melissa's role as bait. Her familiarity with Elmer would make it easier to lure him into a vulnerable position without arousing suspicion. The plan was to take place on May 11th, 1987 in Waterford Township, Michigan. That Monday morning, as part of his usual rounds, Elmer arrived at the gas station where Melissa worked. When Elmer entered the gas station, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, investigators later pieced together a disturbing sequence of events. The robbery began when Jerry allegedly confronted Elmer at gunpoint after he opened the station's safe to retrieve the cash. To make it appear as though Melissa was also a victim, Jerry reportedly forced her to handcuff herself to Elmer. This ruse was designed to convince Elmer that Melissa was not involved in the crime and that she too was being held against her will. Jerry then forced both Elmer and Melissa into a vehicle and drove them approximately 20 miles away to a secluded wooded area. Once they arrived at the remote location, Jerry uncuffed Melissa from Elmer, likely to further maintain the illusion that she was not complicit in the crime. He then handcuffed Elmer's hands behind his back and executed him by shooting him twice in the back of the head with a .25 caliber firearm. The body was discovered the following day by authorities searching for Elmer after he failed to return from his rounds. His car had been left behind at the gas station parking lot, and investigators found no signs of forced entry or struggle inside the station itself. The safe had been emptied of its cash contents, confirming that robbery had been a motive. The nature of the crime suggested premeditation, and police quickly began piecing together evidence pointing toward Jerry and Melissa as suspects. The day after the murder, Jerry and Melissa used some of the stolen cash to purchase a vehicle at an auto dealership in Pontiac, Michigan. Witnesses later reported that Melissa appeared calm and composed during this transaction, showing no signs of distress or fear that might indicate she had been kidnapped or coerced into participating in the robbery. This behavior raised suspicions about her level of involvement in the crime and led investigators to conclude that she was not merely an unwilling participant, but an accomplice who had played an active role in carrying out Jerry's plan. After purchasing the vehicle, the couple fled Michigan and traveled across the country to Moses Lake, Washington. There, they attempted to start anew under assumed identities while evading law enforcement. For several months, they lived quietly. Jerry took a job at a Kmart store while Melissa worked at a card shop, but their past would soon catch up with them. The case later gained national attention in February 1988 when it was featured on the television show Unsolved Mysteries. This program, hosted by Robert Stack, was known for its ability to bring unresolved cases to the public's attention, often resulting in critical tips that helped law enforcement solve crimes. Such was the case with the episode detailing the murder of Elmer and the subsequent flight of Melissa and Jerry. The episode outlined the details of the crime, including how Jerry allegedly used Melissa to lure Elmer away from his car before robbing him of $10,000 and ending his life. It also highlighted the couple's subsequent actions and their move to Washington. The show presented the couple as prime suspects in the case. Melissa was described as wanted for questioning due to her role in the robbery and her connection to Jerry, while Jerry was wanted for murder, armed robbery, and other charges. The broadcast included reenactments of key moments and photographs of both individuals, making it easy for viewers to identify them. Within minutes of its airing, Unsolved Mysteries Hotline received up to 20 calls from viewers who recognized Melissa and Jerry as residents of Moses Lake. These tips came from friends, acquaintances, and neighbors who had seen the couple living quietly in their community since June 1987. The reports provided law enforcement with precise information about their location. According to police accounts, Melissa and Jerry were staying at a friend's house at the time. Ironically, they had watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode themselves earlier that evening and realized their time on the run was over. When officers arrived at their location later that night, Melissa and Jerry were calmly waiting for them. They were arrested without incident and taken into custody at Grant County Jail. Melissa was 17 years old at the time of her arrest, while Jerry was 26. Both were extradited back to Michigan to face charges related to Elmer's murder. Melissa ultimately testified against Jerry as part of a plea deal in which charges of murder and kidnapping against her were dropped in exchange for her cooperation with prosecutors. She admitted to helping plan the robbery, but claimed she did not know that Jerry intended to kill Elmer. Jerry denied his involvement in Elmer's murder, but was convicted on all charges after Melissa testified that he confessed to her shortly after committing the crime. He received 2 consecutive life sentences without parole for first-degree murder and kidnapping. Ultimately, Jerry was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. As of 2025, he remains incarcerated at Thumb Correctional Facility in Michigan. Melissa's legal outcome was markedly different due to her cooperation with authorities. In exchange for her testimony against Jerry, charges of murder and kidnapping were dropped. She pleaded guilty to armed robbery and served 2 years in a juvenile detention facility before being released at age 19. After her release, she returned to Maryland with her 2 children and has since lived a private life away from public scrutiny. Judge John C. Fairbanks' story is one of betrayal, rooted in his dual role as a trusted legal authority and a calculating financial predator in Newport, New Hampshire. For over 3 decades, Fairbanks created a reputation as a reliable pillar of the community, a district court judge and probate attorney who managed estates, trusts, and financial accounts for residents of this small town of about 6,000 people. His clients included elderly retirees, local families, and even members of his own family, many of whom entrusted him with their life savings. Beneath this veneer of respectability, however, Fairbanks plotted an extensive embezzlement scheme, exploiting systemic weaknesses in the judicial and probate systems to siphon millions from those he was sworn to protect. Fairbanks' legal career began in the 1950s, and by the 1970s, he had become a central figure in Newport's civic and political life. He served as a district court judge while simultaneously running a private probate law practice, roles that granted him unparalleled access to the financial affairs of his clients. His prominence extended beyond the courtroom. He chaired the Sullivan County Republican Party, sat on the board of a local bank, and belonged to a well-established family with deep roots in the community. This combination of judicial authority, political influence, and social standing allowed him to operate with little scrutiny, even as his fraudulent activities escalated. His position granted him unrestricted access to client funds, which he diverted into personal accounts through forged documents and falsified financial records. For instance, he informed clients their estates were, quote, experiencing financial difficulties while secretly liquidating assets or transferring funds. One notable case involved a trust established for his 3 sisters, which plummeted from $500,000 in 1985 to $40,000 by 1989 due to his withdrawals. The scope of his theft expanded to include local institutions and even municipal funds. The town of Washington, 2 insurance companies, and a bank were among the entities that filed claims against him, with total losses eventually exceeding $10 million, far surpassing initial estimates of about $2 million. Victims like Harold Creamer, a hardware store owner, lost $130,000 from an inheritance Fairbanks was tasked with managing. Elderly clients, including Gene Henderson, saw their life savings vanish, forcing some to sell generational property or face foreclosure. Newport's probate court, where Fairbanks operated, lacked fundamental safeguards. The Register of Probate managed operations from her nursing home bed, while the presiding judge, afflicted by failing eyesight, failed to detect irregularities in accountings. This absence of oversight allowed Fairbanks to forge documents unchecked, including falsified court orders and fabricated financial statements. His political influence as chairman of the Sullivan County Republican Party also delayed investigations into early complaints. The scheme also thrived on Newport's cultural trust in local institutions. Small-town norms, such as conducting business on handshake agreements, left residents unprepared to question a figure of Fairbanks' stature. This dynamic enabled him to manipulate clients into believing their financial losses were due to market downturns or legal complexities rather than theft. The first cracks in Fairbanks' facade appeared in 1988 when local resident John Tweedy discovered discrepancies in his brother's estate. Tweedy's complaints to the New Hampshire Attorney General's office were initially dismissed, but his persistence led to a 1989 expose in the Eagle Times, a local newspaper. The article triggered a wave of revelations, with over 25 victims coming forward, prompting lawsuits and criminal investigations. By June 1989, mounting pressure forced Fairbanks to resign from the bench. A Sullivan County grand jury indicted him on December 27, 1989, detailing the embezzlement of at least $2 million. At the time, Fairbanks was living at his summer home in Ogunquit, Maine. According to his wife Miriam, he left that morning for coffee in downtown, but never returned. His pickup truck was discovered abandoned 5 miles away in a parking lot near Perkins Cove. Inside the vehicle were no clues about his whereabouts or intentions. Investigators quickly realized that Fairbanks had planned his escape meticulously. He withdrew substantial sums of money, estimated at over $1 million, from secret accounts before disappearing. These funds allowed him to sustain himself comfortably while evading authorities for years. One promising tip came in October 1991, when 2 individuals reported seeing a man resembling Fairbanks on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts. The man was said to be purchasing a condominium under the name Joe. Investigators followed up on this lead, but found no evidence linking Fairbanks to the island or its real estate transactions. Despite these setbacks, investigators continued to pursue any clues about Fairbanks' movements. They discovered that he had a fondness for traveling in the Caribbean, particularly Antigua near St. Kitts. Additionally, telephone logs suggested possible communication between Fairbanks and his wife or children after his disappearance, though Miriam denied any contact with him. For several additional years, the case would see very little development. That was until the year 1994. On Thursday, March 24th, 1994, John Fairbanks checked into the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas under an assumed name. By this point, Fairbanks had been on the run since December 1989. His choice of Las Vegas as a temporary refuge was not unusual for fugitives. The city's transient population and bustling tourism industry made it an ideal location for someone seeking anonymity. However, despite his efforts to remain undetected, Fairbanks' time at the MGM Grand would be his last. On Sunday evening, March 27, 1994, hotel staff entered Fairbanks' room after he overstayed his 2-night reservation. The room was locked from the inside with a deadbolt, and what they found inside shocked them. Fairbanks was discovered dead with a plastic bag over his head. The bag was reportedly a hotel shoe bag secured with rubber bands. A note taped to the mirror identified him as John C. Fairbanks. Written to his son, the note provided personal details that confirmed his identity to investigators. Metro Police Sergeant Bill Keaton later confirmed that an autopsy ruled the cause of death as asphyxiation and classified it as a suicide. Fairbanks' decision to end his life may have been influenced by an unexpected encounter earlier that day. Alan Soucy, a police chief from Sunapee, New Hampshire, who had been involved in the original investigation into Fairbanks' crimes, happened to be staying at the same hotel. Alan later speculated that Fairbanks might have recognized him while walking through the casino floor or other public areas of the hotel. Alan said, "It made me believe that maybe he had seen me because I happened to be in the casino this occurred in. This chance encounter may have triggered panic in Fairbanks, leading him to believe that his capture was imminent." The suicide note left by Fairbanks provided some insight into his thoughts during his final moments. Addressed to his son, it reflected a mixture of regret and resignation, but did not offer any significant revelations about his crimes or fugitive years. The note's placement on the mirror suggests that Fairbanks took a moment to confront himself before taking his life. Fairbanks' death brought an abrupt end to law enforcement's pursuit of him, but left many questions unanswered for both investigators and victims. Authorities were unable to recover much of the stolen money or uncover details about how he had managed to evade capture for so long. His death also deprived victims of any hope for additional restitution or closure through legal proceedings. David McLeod's life is defined by stark opposites, balancing celebrated achievements in Hollywood with a disturbing history of predatory misconduct. Sources vary, but it is stated that David was born either in 1944 or 1945 into a family with significant ties to the entertainment industry. He was the cousin of Warren Beatty and Shirley MacLaine, two of Hollywood's most celebrated actors, and his own career would eventually intersect with theirs in both professional and personal ways. Peers shared that David was deeply ambitious early in his professional life. By the 1980s, he had established himself as a producer and associate producer on several major films. Among his most notable credits were The Pickup Artist in 1987, starring Robert Downey Jr., and Reds in 1981, a film for which Warren Beatty won the Academy Award for Best Director. He was also involved in the production of Ishtar from 1987, a much publicized film that, despite its commercial failure, further cemented David's reputation as a Hollywood insider. These successes placed him in the circle of some of the industry's most influential figures and gave him access to resources and networks that would later complicate efforts to bring him to justice. David's first known run-in with the law occurred in 1986, when he was arrested in Times Square, New York. The charges were grave. He was convicted of sodomizing 3 runaway boys. Despite the seriousness of the offense, he was sentenced to only 2 years of probation, a remarkably lenient outcome that may have emboldened him to continue his predatory activities. This conviction did not result in significant public scrutiny at the time, and David was able to maintain his Hollywood career for several more years. By the late 1980s, David's criminal behavior had escalated both in scope and boldness. According to law enforcement records and contemporaneous news accounts, he began systematically targeting vulnerable boys, often between the ages of 12 and 16, in the Bronx and Brooklyn neighborhoods of New York City. His MO was both manipulative and predatory. David would frequent housing projects and areas known for youth homelessness, flashing large sums of cash and promising the boys new clothes, sneakers, and other material incentives if they agreed to accompany him. Once he had gained their trust, he would lure them to hotel rooms in New Jersey, where he paid them between $30 and $40 to watch or participate in sexual acts. Investigators eventually determined that David had transported at least 15 boys from New York to New Jersey for the purpose of exploitation. The FBI and the New York City Police Department launched a 3-month investigation, culminating in David's arrest in Brooklyn in December 1989. At the time of his arrest, he was reportedly about to pick up more children in his rented car. This moment also revealed that David intended to transport his victims across state lines for illegal purposes. After the arrest on December 14, 1989, David appeared at the Bronx Criminal Court for a hearing related to his 34 charges. His lawyer informed him that detectives from Queens were present to arrest him on additional, unrelated solicitation charges. Recognizing the gravity of his situation, David fled the courthouse before the hearing began, evading a $6,000 bail order. His escape triggered an immediate warrant and launched a multi-agency manhunt spanning the FBI, NYPD, and later Interpol. By 1993, a federal grand jury indicted David in absentia on 6 counts of interstate transportation of minors for prostitution, a felony carrying a maximum 10-year prison sentence per charge. The indictment alleged he had continued exploiting minors while evading capture, potentially across multiple states. The FBI's involvement highlighted the case's national significance, with agents pursuing leads in Canada and Europe. In 1994, Interpol issued a red notice, formally classifying David as a fugitive wanted for international trafficking. In the early 1990s, David's whereabouts were a matter of speculation. Investigators suspected that given his resources and contacts, he could have fled not only New York but the United States altogether. He was known to have connections in Canada, particularly in Toronto and British Columbia, as well as possible links in Europe. These suspicions were reinforced by the fact that David had a prior criminal record in Canada, specifically in Toronto, where he had been charged with crimes involving minors. His fingerprints were already on file with the RCMP, a fact that would later prove crucial down the line. During this period, law enforcement agencies issued bulletins and alerts, and David's case was listed among the most wanted fugitives sought by the FBI and New York City police. As the years passed, David's ability to remain hidden suggested a sophisticated approach to life on the run. He was thought to have lived under assumed names, which allowed him to move with relative anonymity and avoid detection in new communities. The use of aliases is a common tactic among fugitives, but David's background in Hollywood, where reinvention and secrecy are professional assets, likely gave him an edge in maintaining a low profile. Law enforcement agencies in both the United States and Canada work to track financial transactions, monitor known associates, and follow up on reported sightings. However, David's trail often went cold. He was adept at blending in, and the lack of digital surveillance technology in the early 1990s made it easier for someone with means to disappear. There were unconfirmed sightings in various Canadian cities and rumors that he may have traveled to Europe, but none of these leads resulted in his capture. The final chapter unfolded in Montreal, Quebec, though the exact timeline of David's arrival here and activities remains unclear. By the late 1990s, Montreal was a cosmopolitan city with a transient population, making it an ideal place for someone seeking to avoid attention. It is unknown how long David had been living in Montreal or under what name, but police believe he had established some form of life there, possibly under an alias. On December 6, 1998, David's body was discovered in an underground walkway in downtown Montreal, beneath a railway bridge. The circumstances of his death were immediately suspicious in the sense that he was a wanted fugitive, but police quickly ruled out foul play. His body was found next to a bottle of beer and a container of lighter fluid, suggesting the possibility of substance abuse or self-harm, though toxicology tests were ordered to determine the exact cause of death. The identification process was expedited by the fact that his fingerprints were already in the RCMP database due to his prior criminal record in Toronto. The discovery did not immediately close the book on the case. Montreal police, aware of his history and the possibility that he had continued to offend while in Canada, launched a new investigation to determine whether he had committed additional crimes during his time in Montreal. Authorities announced plans to run DNA tests on his remains and compare them to evidence from unsolved sexual assault cases in the city. At the same time, police made a public appeal for information about David's activities and whereabouts during his time in Montreal. They sought to determine how long he had been in the city, what name or names he had been using, and whether he had any known associates or contacts. The investigation was hampered by the lack of digital records and the transient nature of the population he may have interacted with, but authorities were determined to uncover any additional crimes he may have committed. Despite his connections to Hollywood, David's death elicited little public response from his famous relatives. Warren Beatty reportedly acknowledged the situation privately, but refrained from making public statements, and there were no retrospectives following the death. Ultimately, David's DNA was not linked to any active cases at the time of his discovery. Furthermore, the specific details regarding his autopsy findings were not released to the public. Jason Patrick Callahan, born in 1976 and raised in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, was known by his family as a creative young man with a deep appreciation for music, particularly from the Grateful Dead. In the summer of 1995, at the age of 19, Jason was living with his mother, Elizabeth Parks. That June, he decided to embark on a journey, leaving home to follow the Grateful Dead on their East Coast tour. His mother later recounted that Jason had left with little money and few possessions, intending to travel with friends or hitchhike between concert venues. She believed he would return home after the tour safe and sound as always. The Grateful Dead's 1995 summer tour included stops in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, attracting thousands of fans from across the country. Jason attended at least 2 concerts at Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium in Washington, D.C. on June 24th and 25, 1995. Ticket stubs for these shows were later found among his belongings. The vibrant, transient community of Deadheads often traveled together, sharing rides, food, and accommodations. Jason was known to be outgoing and friendly, easily making connections with other fans on the road. However, the specifics of his movements and companions after leaving Myrtle Beach remain unclear. There is no evidence he maintained regular contact with his family during these final days, which isn't entirely unusual with someone of Jason's age. Then, on June 26, 1995, a tragic accident unfolded on a rural stretch of US Route 58 near Emporia in Greensville County, Virginia. At approximately 1:30 p.m., a 1986 Volkswagen Vanagon, driven by Michael Hager, was traveling westbound when it suddenly veered off the road and collided forcefully with 2 trees close to the intersection with Route 605. The van, which had been following the route of the Grateful Dead's summer tour, was carrying Jason as a passenger. Neither Hager nor Jason was wearing a seatbelt, and the severity of the impact resulted in both men being ejected from the vehicle. The injuries sustained were catastrophic, particularly for Jason, who suffered extensive blunt force trauma to his head and torso, and both men died instantly at the scene. The accident occurred under clear weather conditions on a 2-lane highway bordered by dense greenery. There were no immediate signs of hazardous road conditions or obstructions. Investigators later considered the possibility that Hager, who had been driving for several hours after visiting his father in Williamsburg, may have fallen asleep at the wheel, though toxicology reports would ultimately rule out alcohol or drug involvement as contributing factors. First responders arrived swiftly after the crash. Michael Hager was identified without difficulty thanks to the van's registration and personal documents found on his person. In stark contrast, the passenger, later identified as Jason Callahan, had no identification on him. His body, discovered about 15 feet from the wrecked vehicle, bore severe facial injuries, including multiple lacerations and fractures, which made visual identification extremely challenging. The personal effects found with Jason provided the only immediate clues to his identity. He was wearing a red Grateful Dead tie-dye t-shirt commemorating the band's 30th anniversary, light blue Levi's jeans, black Fila athletic shoes, and a macrame beaded necklace. In his pockets, authorities found a yellow Bic lighter, $1 in quarters, 2 ticket stubs for Grateful Dead concerts, and a handwritten note addressed to Jason from 2 individuals named Caroline O and Caroline T. The note, written on a scrap of paper, read, "Sorry we had to go, see you around, call me." The phone number, missing an area code, could not be traced to any active line. Authorities also documented amateurish tattoos on Jason's arms, a pierced left ear without an earring, and a scar on his back. The investigation into the passenger's identity began immediately but was fraught with challenges. The extent of Jason's facial trauma required forensic reconstructions rather than traditional photographs. Early sketches by local artists depicted a young Caucasian male with shoulder-length, curly, light brown hair and brown eyes, but these images did not closely resemble Jason's actual appearance, limiting their effectiveness in generating leads. Dental records showed no prior dental work, but all third molars were fully erupted, suggesting he was at least in his late teens. Fingerprints were taken, but matched no entries in national databases. Despite distributing descriptions and reconstructions to law enforcement agencies and within the Grateful Dead community, no one came forward to identify the young man. The investigation into the crash also focused on Michael Hager's background. Hager, a student from South Carolina, had attended the same Grateful Dead concerts as Callahan and had recently visited his father in Williamsburg. It was believed that Hager may have picked up Jason while hitchhiking between Fairfax and Gloucester, Virginia, though this detail could not be confirmed. The note found with Callahan, particularly the reference to Caroline, became a focal point for investigators. The area code of 914 pointed to New York's Westchester County, but follow-up inquiries with individuals named Caroline in the region yielded no results. The ticket stubs were traced to a Pennsylvania-based reseller who, due to the high volume of sales, could not recall specific buyers. In July 1995, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a bulletin describing the unidentified passenger as a white male, around 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing 150 to 170 pounds, and estimated to be between 16 and 21 years old. Flyers featuring forensic reconstructions and details of his clothing and belongings were distributed at Grateful Dead concerts and posted in online forums. Despite these efforts, the case quickly stagnated. By 1996, authorities had compared the unidentified man's dental records and physical characteristics against more than 200 missing persons cases, but all were ruled out. The absence of a missing person report proved to be a significant barrier, as Jason's mother, Elizabeth Parks, later explained that she had assumed her son was living a nomadic lifestyle and did not realize he was missing until many years later. For nearly 20 years, the identity of the young man killed in that 1995 Virginia car crash remained a mystery. Despite the efforts of police, the case went cold. Over the years, the case lingered in the background of missing persons forums and cold case websites, but it wasn't until around 2010 that it began to attract widespread attention from a new generation of digital detectives. The breakthrough in the Grateful Doe case was not the result of a single discovery, but rather the culmination of years of incremental progress, amplified by the reach of social media and the techniques of open source intelligence. Platforms like Reddit, Imgur, and Facebook became the primary arenas for discussion and investigation. Users shared facial reconstructions, details about the crash, and theories about the victim's identity. The case was especially popular among true crime enthusiasts and members of the Deadhead community who felt a personal connection to the story. A pivotal moment arrived in January 2015 when a Reddit user known as Zombie Gray posted a detailed summary of the case, including images of the facial reconstructions, photos of the victim's belongings, and a call to action for anyone with information. The post included the now famous note addressed to Jason and the ticket stubs from the Grateful Dead concerts. The post quickly went viral, being shared across multiple platforms and reaching a massive audience, including people who had attended the same concerts or lived in the same regions as the unidentified man. The viral spread of the Reddit posts marked a turning point. Armchair detectives began to apply various techniques, combing through public records, old concert photos, missing persons databases, and social media archives. Some users attempted to trace the phone number on the note, while others examined archives of local newspapers and compared the facial reconstructions to yearbook photos and images posted by Grateful Dead fans from the mid-1990s. One of the most significant developments occurred when a former roommate of Jason's recognized the facial reconstruction and details from the viral post. The roommate, who had lived with Jason in Illinois in late 1994 and early 1995, reached out to the moderators of the Grateful Doe subreddit and provided additional information about Jason's background and habits. He described Jason as a passionate Grateful Dead fan who had worked at a McDonald's and left in early 1995 to follow the band on tour. The roommate also shared photographs of Jason, which bore a striking resemblance to the reconstructions and the clothing described in the crash report. Parallel to the activity on Reddit, a dedicated Facebook group called Who Was Grateful Doe became a hub for crowdsourced investigation. Members of the group meticulously compared details from the case with missing persons reports and reached out to people who might have known Jason. The group's collaborative efforts helped to maintain momentum and ensure that new information was quickly disseminated and discussed. In January 2015, the viral posts and Facebook discussions reached Jason Callahan's family. His mother and his half-sister saw the reconstructions and recognized the details as matching Jason, whom they had last seen in June 1995 when he left home in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina to follow the Grateful Dead. Prompted by the online revelations, Jason's mother filed a missing person report with the Myrtle Beach Police Department in January 2015. Law enforcement then coordinated with the Virginia Medical Examiner's Office and the National Missing and Unidentified Person System to obtain DNA samples from Jason's family. Initial tests were inconclusive, but further analysis ultimately confirmed that the unidentified man was indeed Jason Callahan. The official announcement was made in December 2015, bringing closure to a case that had haunted investigators and online communities for 2 decades. The news was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow as family members expressed gratitude for the efforts of the internet sleuths who had made the identification possible. Shannon Michelson, Jason's half-sister, posted a heartfelt message on the Facebook group, thanking everyone who had contributed to the search and explaining how the online community had helped her reconnect with her brother's story after so many years. Angie Hausman was born in 1984 and grew up in the close-knit community of St. Anne, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. As a child, Angie was known for her joyful spirit, her friendliness, and her generous heart. She lived with her mother, Diane Bone, her stepfather, Ron Bone, and her younger brother, and was also close to her extended family. Her family's home was filled with love and laughter, and Angie was cherished by everyone who knew her. From an early age, she was described as a people person. Her cousin, Christina Maguillon, who was only a year and a half older, recalled that Angie was always smiling and laughing. She would greet strangers in stores and had an easy way of making friends wherever she went. Angie's outgoing and trusting personality was a defining trait. She was the kind of child who would offer a helping hand to anyone in need and was eager to share her happiness with others. She attended Buter Elementary School, where she was a 4th grade student. She enjoyed her classes and was always willing to participate in school activities. Her teachers noted her curiosity and willingness to help other students. Her favorite activities included playing outside with friends, riding her bike, and spending time with her family and pets. She was especially fond of animals and often talked about wanting to be a veterinarian when she grew up. One story that stands out among her family's memories is when Angie won a $500 shopping spree at a local toy store. Rather than spend all the money on herself, Angie asked for a bicycle with a radio and insisted that the rest of the money be used to help other children who needed things. Her stepfather kept the bicycle for years, even as it rusted, as a testament to Angie's selflessness and kind heart. On November 18th, 1993, tragedy struck as 9-year-old Angie went missing. That Thursday began as any other. Angie got up to school and rode the school bus home as she always did. Her stop was only about 8 houses away from her family's home, and the short walk was a routine she had followed countless times without incident. Angie got off the bus at her usual stop at around 4 p.m. She was last seen by her bus driver and several classmates who watched her walk away from the bus, presumably heading home. The weather that afternoon was cold, typical for late November in Missouri, but there was nothing to suggest danger lurking so close to home. Angie never made it to her front door. When she failed to arrive home, her family became immediately concerned. After searching the neighborhood and finding no sign of Angie, her family contacted the St. Anne Police Department at approximately 7:10 p.m. The authorities responded quickly, recognizing the urgency of a missing child case. As the hours passed with no sign of the young girl, worry turned to dread. The police requested the assistance of the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, activating them on November 22, 1993, to help coordinate the search and investigation. The community rallied to support the family, with neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement combing the area for any clue that might lead to Angie's safe return. Flyers were distributed, media outlets covered the story, and tips began to pour in. Despite these efforts, there were no credible sightings or leads in the days following her disappearance. The search for Angie quickly expanded beyond St. Anne. Investigators considered the possibility that she had been abducted by a stranger, as there was no evidence to suggest she had run away or left voluntarily. The case drew attention from the FBI and other agencies, and the community held out hope that Angie would be found alive. 9 agonizing days after the disappearance, on the morning of November 27, 1993, a deer hunter made a horrific discovery in the Bush Wildlife Area in St. Charles County, about 20 miles from St. Anne. At around 10:30 a.m., the hunter stumbled upon the body of a young girl tied to a tree in a remote wooded area. Authorities were immediately called to the scene, and it was soon confirmed that the body was that of Angie Hausman. The circumstances of this discovery were as disturbing as they were heartbreaking. She was found nude, her wrists handcuffed behind her back, and her head wrapped almost entirely in duct tape, leaving only her nose exposed so she could breathe. Her eyes and mouth were also covered with duct tape, and she had been gagged with fabric torn from her own underwear. The position in which she was found suggested she had been tied to the tree and left there alive. The medical examiner determined that Angie had suffered a significant violent sexual assault and had struggled extensively to free herself before she ultimately died. The autopsy revealed that Angie had not died immediately after her abduction. Instead, she had been held captive for up to a week, during which time she was tortured and assaulted. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and in a weakened state by the time she was left in the woods. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. Angie had succumbed to the freezing temperatures, likely only hours before her body was discovered. Ice had begun to form over her body, indicating that she was exposed to the elements for some time before her death. The forensic evidence collected at the scene included duct tape, handcuffs, and a fingerprint on the tape, as well as biological evidence such as semen. However, forensic technology in 1993 was not advanced enough to yield definitive results. DNA analysis was in its infancy, and the evidence could not be matched to any known suspects at the time. The fingerprint was run through available databases, but no match was found. Investigators preserved all evidence meticulously, hoping that future advances in technology would provide answers. The Major Case Squad worked for more than a year, chasing down every possible lead. According to Lieutenant Colonel John Langford, who was heavily involved in the case, the volume of leads was overwhelming. If we had 15 leads called in that week, we were going to have 15 different investigations going, he later recalled. Every tip, no matter how small or unlikely, was pursued. Detectives interviewed known sex offenders, checked alibis, and investigated anyone with a history of violence or sexual crimes against children in the area. They also explored the possibility of a connection to other unsolved cases, such as the abduction and murder of Cassidy Center, another young girl who disappeared in nearby Hazelwood just a month after Angie. This raised fears of a serial predator, but the cases were ultimately found to be unrelated. Investigators also faced the challenge of public fear and media scrutiny. The case received extensive coverage and the community was on high alert. Parents kept their children close and rumors swirled about possible suspects. Innocent people were named and questioned, adding to the emotional toll on the community and law enforcement alike. The pressure to solve the case was immense, but every promising lead seemed to end in disappointment. Over the years, the case was periodically reviewed as new technology became available. Evidence was re-examined and DNA samples were tested against expanding databases. In 2017, investigators thought they had finally found the killer, but the lead turned out to be another dead end. Nevertheless, detectives continued to follow up on tips and recheck facts, refusing to let Angie's case fade into obscurity. Fast forward to 2019, a pivotal moment came when forensic lab technicians retested evidence from the case. They focused on a piece of her underwear, specifically the pink trim of 2 torn pieces found at the crime scene. This item had been preserved for decades and was now subjected to the most advanced DNA analysis available. The results were stunning. Analysts identified DNA belonging to 2 individuals, Angie Hausman and an unknown male. When this unknown DNA profile was analyzed, it matched Earl Webster Cox, a convicted child predator who was already in federal custody. Earl Cox was no stranger to law enforcement. Born and raised in St. Louis, he had a long and disturbing criminal history. In 1975, Earl enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, but in 1982, he was dishonorably discharged after multiple sex offenses involving juveniles while stationed in Germany. He was court-martialed and sentenced to 8 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary. After his release in 1985, Earl was placed on parole and moved to Missouri, living only a quarter mile from where Angie was abducted. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Earl continued to offend. In 1989, he was investigated and later charged in Overland, Missouri for the sexual abuse of 2 girls at a park near Buter Elementary School where Angie attended. His parole was revoked and he was sent back to prison only to be released again in December 1992. By the time of Angie's abduction in November 1993, Cox was living in the St. Anne area. His criminal activity did not stop there. He later ran an international child ring and was deemed by the state a sexually dangerous person likely to reoffend if released. At the time of the DNA match in 2019, Cox was incarcerated in a federal facility in North Carolina under the Adam Walsh Act, which allows for the indefinite detention of sexually dangerous individuals. With the DNA match in hand, St. Charles County prosecuting attorney Tim Lomar and his team moved swiftly. On June 5, 2019, Lomar announced that Earl had been charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and sodomy in connection with Angie Hausman's death. The charges were based not only on the DNA evidence, but also on Earl's history and proximity to Angie's home at the time of her abduction. While the DNA evidence against Earl was overwhelming, investigators and prosecutors expressed doubts that he acted alone. Tim stated at a press conference that there was reason to believe another individual may have been involved in Angie's abduction and murder. No one was eliminated as a suspect, and the investigation remained open to the possibility of additional perpetrators. Tim expressed confidence that new leads would surface, potentially pointing to other individuals connected to the crime. Once charged, Earl was transferred from federal custody in North Carolina to Missouri to face trial. The DNA evidence was so compelling that Earl ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. This plea ensured that he would never be released to harm another child. Cassidy Center was born in the early 1980s and grew up in Hazelwood, a quiet family-oriented suburb just northwest of St. Louis, Missouri. The Center family, consisting of Cassidy, her parents, and at least one sibling, was known in their neighborhood as friendly and close-knit. Cassidy's parents worked hard to provide a stable and nurturing environment, emphasizing the importance of education, kindness, and community involvement. Their home on Tall Tree Court was situated in a neighborhood considered safe, where children often played outside and walked to friends' houses without fear. From a young age, Cassidy was described as bright, energetic, and deeply compassionate. Friends and teachers at her elementary school recalled her as a diligent student who enjoyed reading, art, and participating in class activities. She was particularly fond of drawing and was often seen with a sketchbook, capturing scenes from her life or creating imaginative stories through her illustrations. Cassidy's teachers noted her curiosity and eagerness to learn, qualities that made her well-liked among her peers and respected by adults. She participated in after-school activities including Girl Scouts and local sports teams, which helped her develop teamwork skills and a sense of responsibility. On weekends, she enjoyed riding her bike, playing in local parks, and visiting friends' houses for sleepovers or homework sessions. Her parents encouraged her independence while maintaining clear boundaries, trusting her to walk short distances in their suburban neighborhood, a reflection of the sense of safety at the time. On December 1st, 1993, Cassidy returned home from school as she did every weekday. She and her mother, Rhonda, lived in the lower half of a house which was owned by Michael Goldbeck. That afternoon, Cassidy briefly visited with Goldbeck, who took a moment to check that her personal alarm, a small yellow device meant to emit a loud noise if she was in danger, was working properly. Satisfied that she was safe, Cassidy left the house at about 3:30 p.m., intending to walk a short distance up Tall Tree Court toward a friend's house on Spring Forest Lane. Around the same time, Mr. and Mrs. Haneke, who lived on Spring Forest Lane, heard a strange noise coming from their property. Investigating the source, they discovered a yellow alarm, still buzzing, and a pen lying near their property line. Unbeknownst to them at the time, these items belonged to Cassidy Center. The alarm's presence outside, actively sounding, was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Rhonda returned home a few minutes after 5 p.m. Upon calling Cassidy's friend's house, she was alarmed to learn that her daughter had never arrived. Concerned, Rhonda and Goldbeck searched the neighborhood, but their efforts yielded nothing. Around this time, they received word that Cassidy's personal alarm had been found on the Haneke's lawn. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Goldbeck contacted the police. Law enforcement responded immediately, launching a ground and air search that continued for days. The case quickly drew significant attention due to the circumstances and the fact that another young girl, Angie Houseman, who we just discussed, had recently disappeared and been found murdered in the same region. The St. Louis Area Major Crimes Task Force, including both city and county police, coordinated the investigation, and the FBI provided technical support. Despite the intensive search, days passed without any sign of Cassidy. On the morning of December 9th, 1993, two people walking in an alley in the city of St. Louis made a grim discovery. They found the body of a young girl, later identified as Cassidy Center, wrapped in two bed comforters and a pink curtain. Her jacket and sweater were pulled up above her chest, and her jeans were pulled down over her ankles inside out. A sheet was looped around each ankle and tied in the middle, binding her legs together. The body was clothed in the same pink and white polka dot shirt and white tennis shoes that Cassidy had been wearing when she disappeared. Cassidy's mother was called to the police morgue, where she made the heartbreaking identification. The location where Cassidy's body was found was a heavily traveled alley with several vacant lots, making it unlikely the body had been there for long. Investigators believe the body had been moved there shortly before its discovery. The autopsy revealed that Cassidy had suffered at least 4 abrasions to her scalp and multiple skull fractures, as well as numerous bruises on her face, chest, abdomen, and back. The condition of her scalp and the distribution of the injuries indicated that she was alive when she received most of the blows. The medical examiner concluded that Cassidy died from at least 5 significant blows to the head, and that she likely lived less than an hour after the attack. Decomposition in the upper portion of her body suggested she had been dead for several days before being found. As the investigation continued, forensic evidence became critical. Police examined tire tracks at the scene where Cassidy's body was found, and discovered a unique tire pattern that could only have been made by a Goodyear Workhorse light truck tire. Investigators soon learned that a man named Thomas Brooks Jr. had rented a U-Haul truck from a local rental company in Hazelwood on December 8th, the day before Cassidy's body was found. A neighbor of Thomas's sister named Cassandra Quinn reported seeing a U-Haul truck backing out of her driveway that same day. When police compared the tire tracks at the scene to the tires on the U-Haul truck Brooks had rented, they found a positive match. Further investigation revealed that Denise Johnson, a previous tenant of Cassandra Quinn's home, had left behind a pink floral comforter and pink curtains, items that matched those found wrapped around Cassidy's body. Police obtained a search warrant for Cassandra's home, where they collected hair and fiber evidence. Laboratory analysis showed that fibers from the residence matched those found on Cassidy's body, the comforters, the curtain, and even her clothing. DNA testing confirmed that bloodstains on the basement floor matched Cassidy's blood, and a bed slat recovered from the basement was consistent with the weapon used to inflict Cassidy's fatal head injuries. Paint from a U-Haul dolly matched paint samples found on the sheets, comforters, and clothing recovered with Cassidy's body. On February 3, 1994, Thomas Brooks Jr. was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted rape. He was held without bond at the St. Louis County Jail. His sister and another resident of her home, LaFrance Wilson, were also charged with hindering prosecution for lying to investigators about Brooks's involvement. Brooks initially denied any involvement in Cassidy's death. However, after further questioning, he changed his story multiple times before ultimately confessing. According to his final statement, Brooks had been at his sister's house when he saw Cassidy walking up the yard. Cassidy asked if his nephews were home, and Brooks seized the opportunity to grab her by the hand and drag her down the basement steps. Cassidy's fall down the stairs activated her personal alarm, which Brooks picked up, took upstairs, and threw outside, where it was later found by the neighbors. He returned to the basement, told Cassidy to pull her pants down, and when she screamed and tried to escape, decided to kill her. He struck her in the head multiple times with a bed slat until she collapsed. Brooks then covered Cassidy's body with bedding and drapery and left for work. The following day, Brooks' sister told him she did not want to know anything about the body in her basement and insisted he remove it. Brooks returned and moved Cassidy's body behind a freezer to better conceal it. On December 8th, he rented the U-Haul truck, worked his shift, then returned to Cassandra's house, removed the body using a two-wheel dolly, and drove it to the alley in St. Louis where it was ultimately discovered. His trial began in September 1995. Prosecutors presented overwhelming physical evidence, including forensic links and the confession, to establish his guilt. They also highlighted Brooks's violent history and pattern of predatory behavior. The defense attempted to argue that Brooks's troubled upbringing and intellectual limitations should be considered mitigating factors, but the jury ultimately rejected these arguments. Brooks was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His legal team appealed the conviction, challenging the admissibility of his confession and the proportionality of the death penalty, but the courts upheld the verdict due to the severity of the crime and the strength of the evidence. Brooks died in prison in 2011 before his execution could be carried out. Ennis Cosby, the son of Bill Cosby, was murdered in the early hours of January 16, 1997 in a crime that shocked the nation and devastated his family. The events of that night, pieced together from witness accounts, forensic evidence, and later confessions, reveal a tragic sequence. Ennis, then 27 years old, was in Los Angeles during his winter break from graduate studies at Columbia University's Teachers College. He was known for his intelligence, warmth, and advocacy for people with learning disabilities, having overcome dyslexia himself. On the night of his murder, Ennis was driving his mother's dark green Mercedes-Benz SL convertible north on Interstate 405, passing through the Sepulveda Pass in the Bel Air neighborhood of Los Angeles. At approximately 1 a.m., Ennis experienced a flat tire and pulled off the freeway onto Skirball Center Drive, a dimly lit side road. He called Stephanie Crane, a woman he had recently begun seeing, to let her know about his predicament. Crane drove out to meet him, arriving a short time later. She parked her car behind Ennis's Mercedes, using her headlights to illuminate the area so he could change the tire. Crane tried to persuade Ennis to call a tow truck, but he insisted on handling the repair himself. As he worked on the tire, Crane remained in her car with the engine and heater running, watching him through the windshield. Suddenly, a man appeared at her window. He was wearing a light-colored knit cap and, according to Crane, seemed bumbling and unsure of himself. The man threatened her, saying, "Open the door or I'll kill you." Terrified, Crane immediately drove away, but only for about 50 feet. She stopped and turned around, hoping her abrupt action would scare off the intruder and protect Ennis. In those brief moments, she heard a gunshot. Crane quickly returned to the scene, frantic and calling out for Ennis. She saw a man running toward a parked car nearby. Then she looked down and found Ennis lying on the ground beside the driver's side of his vehicle in a pool of blood. She called police using her car phone and they arrived soon after. The initial police assessment suggested robbery as the motive, but the scene raised questions. Ennis was still wearing his Rolex watch and $60 in cash remained in his pocket, indicating the killer had either been interrupted or fled in haste. Forensic analysis of the scene later revealed that Ennis had been shot at close range within 4 feet, as evidenced by gunpowder residue on the left side of his face. Crime scene photographs, which were not published but described in media reports, showed Ennis lying face up, his right hand still clutching a pack of Natural American Spirit cigarettes. Notably, his corpse had a split but unswollen lip, suggesting he was struck in the mouth after he had already died, a detail that pointed to additional violence inflicted post-mortem. When questioned by police, Crane stated that the culprit was a slender white man aged around 25 to 35. Despite the high-profile nature of the case, the initial investigation faced significant challenges. Investigators considered several possibilities, including whether the killer had simply stumbled upon Ennis or if the tire had been intentionally sabotaged to lure him to a vulnerable location. They examined the flat tire for signs of tampering and reviewed cellular phone records, but these avenues did not yield immediate breakthroughs. Another witness reported seeing a suspicious car in the area around the time of the shooting. Police released a drawing of this driver, labeling him a possible witness wanted for questioning. Days after the sketches were made public, police detained a man matching the description, but he was ultimately found to have no connection to the crime. With few concrete leads, the investigation threatened to stall. The murder of Bill Cosby's son generated intense media scrutiny, which was both a blessing and a curse for investigators. The LAPD was inundated with more than 800 tips from the public, many of which had to be painstakingly investigated and ultimately ruled out. The high-profile nature of the case also prompted the National Enquirer to offer a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer. While the reward generated a flood of tips, it was one particular call that would prove decisive. The caller provided information about the murder that had not been made public, including the correct caliber of the gun used, a .38, not the 9mm that had been widely reported by the press. The caller also relayed that he had overheard a man talking about, quote, killing a black guy, a chilling detail that matched the circumstances of the crime. This tipster, later identified as Christopher So, was a former acquaintance of a man named Mikhail Markasev, who would turn out to be the man responsible for the killing. The tip from So led police to focus on Markasev, an 18-year-old Ukrainian immigrant who had come to the United States with his mother in 1989. He had a juvenile criminal record and was known to police for previous arrests related to drug possession. He lived in North Hollywood and worked at a local pottery shop. So's information was crucial not only for its accuracy, but also because he was able to lead police to the location where the murder weapon had been discarded. So revealed that 2 days after the killing, he had driven Markasev and another friend, Michael Chang, to the area near the murder scene so they could search for the gun. Markasev was described as agitated and panicked during this trip, repeatedly insisting, "I got to go back, I got to find that gun, I got to go away from here, I got to hide out." So also testified that Markasev had openly admitted to the killing, saying, "I killed a N-word. It's big. It's all over the news." When So realized the magnitude of what Markasev was saying, he recognized Markasev from the composite sketch broadcast on television and decided to contact the National Enquirer instead of the police, citing a personal dislike for law enforcement due to a previous embezzlement arrest. With So's guidance, police recovered the .38 caliber revolver and a knitted cap in a wooded area a few miles from the murder scene. Ballistics tests confirmed that the gun was the one used to kill Ennis, and forensic analysis linked a hair found in the cap to Markasev. On March 12, 1997, nearly 2 months after the murder, police arrested Markasev at his North Hollywood apartment. He was taken into custody without incident. The following day, prosecutors filed charges of murder and attempted robbery against him. The indictment included the special circumstance of murder committed during an attempted robbery, making Markasev eligible for the death penalty under California law. He pleaded not guilty to the charges. The grand jury convened in April 1997 and indicted him on both counts, allowing the case to proceed directly to trial without a preliminary hearing. Markasev's acquaintances Sarah Peters and Michael Chang testified before the grand jury about the events of the night of the murder. Peters recalled that she, her boyfriend Eli Zachariah, and Markasev had been using cocaine and had stopped at a park and ride lot about 450 feet from where Ennis was fixing his tire. While Eli was on the phone, Markasev left without explanation, and within minutes, Peters heard a loud noise like a car backfiring. Markasev returned, urging them to leave immediately but refusing to explain what had happened. Their subsequent stop at a wooded area matched the location where the murder weapon was later found. Michael Chung later attempted to help Markasev find the discarded gun. In his statement to the grand jury, Chung said that Markasev had admitted to killing Ennis, explaining that Ennis was frightened when he pulled the gun and demanded money, and that he shot him because he was taking too long to comply. In addition to forensic evidence, investigators intercepted a letter from the suspect to an acquaintance. In it, Markasev admitted to the murder, writing, "I shot the N-word. I went to rob a connection and obviously found something else." Markasev's attorneys tried to argue that the letters were forged and that Eli was the real killer, but these arguments were ultimately rejected by the court. After his indictment, Markasev continued to plead not guilty to the charges. Prosecutors initially considered seeking the death penalty, but later announced that they would not pursue it. Jury selection for the trial began in June 1998, and the prosecution presented a 5-day case that included eyewitness testimony, the confession letters, forensic evidence linking Markasev to the murder weapon, and testimony from witnesses who said Markasev had searched for the gun and spoken of shooting a black man. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the police investigation, suggesting that the lineup had been rigged and that witnesses were motivated by the reward money offered by tabloids. In February 2001, Markasev wrote a letter to California Deputy Attorney General Kyle Brody in which he finally confessed to the crime. In his letter, he stated, "I am guilty and I want to do the right thing. More than anything, I want to apologize to the victim's family. It is my duty as a Christian, and it's the least I can do after the great wickedness for which I am responsible. This is not about me, but about those whose lives I've marred. My motive is to at least try to mend the things which I've destroyed." He also asked that the Cosby family receive a copy of his notice of abandonment of appeals, and he expressed a desire to apologize personally to them. This confession came after years of appeals and public denials, and legal experts noted that it likely closed any remaining avenues for overturning his conviction. Ultimately, Markasev was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for using a firearm during the commission of the crime. Rapid City, South Dakota is a mid-sized community nestled in the Black Hills, known for its close-knit neighborhoods and blue-collar workforce. In the early 1990s, the city's economy was anchored by manufacturing and processing plants, including the wood products facility where both Tina Marcotta and Tom Kueter were employed. The plant was a significant local employer, drawing workers from across the region and fostering a workplace environment where employees often knew each other well, both professionally and personally. Tina was a 27-year-old mother of 2 children. She was described by friends and family as outgoing, caring, and deeply committed to her children. At the time of her disappearance, Tina was navigating a difficult period in her personal life, having recently separated from her husband. Despite these challenges, she maintained steady employment at the plant, which provided a sense of stability for her and her family. Tom was a former longtime employee at the same wood processing plant. Married with children of his own, Tom was known among his co-workers for his skill as a forklift operator. However, some colleagues noted that he could be temperamental, particularly in his interactions with women who did not reciprocate his advances. While there was no public indication of a close personal relationship between Tina and Tom, their paths crossed regularly due to their shared workplace. On the night of June 24th, 1994, Tina finished her late shift at Black Hills Molding. As she left the building around 12:30 a.m., she discovered that her car, a 1984 Dodge, had a flat tire. Realizing she was stranded, Tina returned to the office and used a payphone to call her friend Vicky Riddle for help. During their conversation, Tina noticed a vehicle approaching the plant entrance. She paused the call to check who it was, then returned to the phone and told Vicky that Tom, a former co-worker, had offered her a ride home. Tina thanked Vicky and ended the call. This was the last confirmed contact anyone had with her. Shortly after, Tom left the area with Tina in his 1975 Pontiac Le Mans. The two had previously worked together at Black Hills Molding and were known to be casual acquaintances. Tom arrived home at approximately 3:30 a.m., according to his wife, Nancy. Nancy later recounted to investigators that Tom immediately washed his clothes and shoelaces, an unusual act for him at that hour. She had no prior knowledge of his whereabouts that night. The following morning, Tina's live-in boyfriend, Patrick Gleason, awoke to find her missing. After contacting Vicky Riddle, he learned about the late-night phone call and Tom's involvement. Patrick called Tom, who agreed to meet him at Vicky's house to discuss the situation. During the meeting, Tom denied giving Tina a ride and insisted she must have been mistaken. When Patrick asked if Tom and Tina were having an affair, Tom denied it, but according to Patrick, did not display his usual assertiveness, which struck Patrick as odd. Later that day, Patrick and Tom went to the Rapid City Police Department to file a missing persons report. Officers located Tina's car in the Black Hills Molding parking lot. The left front tire had been slashed, confirming suspicions of foul play. Thereafter, a homicide investigation was launched. Over the next 2 days, investigators focused on Tom's account of his activities on the night of Tina's disappearance. Tom claimed he had played in a softball game earlier in the evening, then drove a friend home, dropping him off around 11:30 p.m. He said his car broke down behind the Super Duper grocery store, where he spent nearly 3 hours fixing the carburetor under a streetlight before finally arriving home at 3:30 a.m. without waking his wife or children. While his participation in the softball game and dropping off his friend were corroborated, the rest of his alibi quickly unraveled. Residents near the grocery store told police they had not seen anyone working on a car for hours that night, and forensic examination of Tom's car revealed no mechanical issues that would support his story. On June 27th, police brought Tom in for a second interview at his current workplace, Forest Products Distributors. Investigators informed him that bloodstains had been found in his car and that DNA testing would determine if they matched Tina. Tom continued to deny any involvement, but was visibly agitated during questioning. Shockingly, on the following morning, June the 28th, Tom was found dead at Forest Products Distributors. 2 co-workers discovered his body beneath the rear wheel of his forklift, which was still running. The keys were in his pocket, and the parking brake was later found to be inoperable. The Pennington County coroner initially ruled the death a theorizing that Tom had intentionally placed himself under the forklift to simulate an accident. There were no signs of a struggle or defensive wounds, and no drag marks indicated he had not been moved post-mortem. However, this ruling was later challenged by Tom's family, particularly his wife Nancy, who argued that Tom would never abandon their children and suggested a co-worker with a grudge might have been responsible. In 2000, a judge determined that there was insufficient evidence to conclusively rule the death a suicide, enabling Nancy to collect Tom's life insurance benefits. For over a year, the mystery of Tina's disappearance persisted, but then on October 11th, 1995, a worker at Forest Products Distributors discovered skeletal remains under a woodpile in a remote section of the lumberyard. Clothing fragments and dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Tina. The autopsy determined that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely inflicted on the night she vanished. Investigators concluded that Tina had been killed elsewhere and her body later hidden at the lumberyard. A critical piece of evidence emerged years later when Tina's daughter disclosed that DNA testing had matched blood found on Tom's shoe to her mother. This finding, though not disclosed in official police reports, was cited by Tina's family as definitive proof of Tom's involvement in her murder. Additionally, bloodstains discovered in Tom's 1975 Pontiac were suspected to belong to Tina, though degradation of the samples prevented conclusive confirmation. The slashed tire on Tina's car, identified as a deliberate act using a knife, became a focal point for investigators. They theorized that Tom had sabotaged the tire to isolate Tina in the parking lot after her shift, creating an opportunity to approach her under the guise of offering assistance. Law enforcement concluded that Tom murdered Tina after she rejected romantic or sexual advances, a motive inferred from witness accounts of his volatile interactions with women. The confrontation allegedly turned violent when Tina resisted, leading to her death by blunt force trauma. To evade prosecution, police believed Tom staged his death as a suicide by ensuring his family could collect life insurance benefits, a possibility confirmed when a judge overturned the initial suicide ruling in 2000. Tom may have viewed this act as a way to provide financially for his wife and children while avoiding a murder conviction. Tom's family consistently disputed the suicide ruling, arguing that the crime scene had been staged to mimic self-inflicted death. Nancy highlighted the lack of a suicide note and Tom's apparent lack of depressive symptoms in the days leading up to his death. She also pointed to unresolved leads, including rumors of a co-worker who harbored a grudge against Tom, though no evidence supported this claim. Gretchen Burford was born on June 6, 1938 in Seattle, Washington. She spent her formative years in the Pacific Northwest, where she was known for her intelligence and determination. After raising 3 children, Gretchen made a significant life decision in her early 40s. She chose to pursue a career in law, enrolling in law school at the age of 41. By 1984, Gretchen had completed her legal education and established a full-time law practice in Palo Alto, California. She specialized in criminal defense with a particular focus on juvenile law. Her work was characterized by a deep sense of justice and empathy for her clients, many of whom were young people facing challenging circumstances. Gretchen was well integrated into the local community, both professionally and personally. She balanced her demanding career with her roles as a mother and an active participant in local affairs. Her reputation as a compassionate and principled attorney earned her respect among peers and neighbors. Those who knew her described her as warm, approachable, and deeply committed to helping others, especially vulnerable youth. Now fast forward to the evening of February 26, 1988, where Palo Alto became the scene of a shocking and violent crime. Gretchen, then 49 years old, was finishing her workday and stopped at a local bank to deposit a check valued at around $400. She parked her car in what she considered a safe neighborhood, unaware that this routine errand would be her last. When she returned to her vehicle, she was confronted by a man who either had been waiting nearby or had already hidden himself inside her car. Armed with a knife, the man set in motion a terrifying sequence of events. Under threat from her assailant, Gretchen was forced to drive to another ATM. The motive was clear. The man wanted to withdraw as much money as possible. At the ATM, she attempted to withdraw cash, but she entered an amount that was too high for the machine to process, causing the transaction to fail. Investigators and observers later speculated that this was a deliberate act by Gretchen, perhaps intended to sabotage the robbery, delay the process, or attract attention to her predicament. After the failed withdrawal, Gretchen saw an opportunity to escape. She accelerated away from the ATM at high speed, likely hoping to flee her attacker or draw attention to her distress. Her car traveled only about 150 yards before crashing into a parked vehicle. The noise of the collision drew the attention of 2 young men nearby who rushed toward the scene to offer assistance. As the car came to a halt, a violent struggle erupted inside the vehicle. During this confrontation, the unknown man stabbed Gretchen once in the chest with his knife. Despite her severe injury, Gretchen managed to exit the vehicle, desperately seeking help. Eyewitnesses later recalled her crying out, "He stabbed me," as she emerged from the car. Meanwhile, her attacker exited on the opposite side and fled on foot, while also shouting, "He stabbed me," possibly in an attempt to confuse witnesses or delay pursuit. Emergency responders arrived quickly at the chaotic scene. Gretchen was rushed to the hospital, but the stab wound proved fatal, and she died shortly after arriving at the emergency room. The crime scene yielded several important clues, including the failed ATM transaction, which provided a timestamp and confirmed Gretchen's presence and actions during the abduction. Witnesses who saw the crash and the ensuing struggle were able to provide descriptions of the suspect and recount the sequence of events immediately following the stabbing. Forensic evidence collected from the car and surrounding area included fingerprints and biological material, which would later become crucial as DNA technology advanced. Initially, the crime was classified as a robbery gone wrong. The primary motive appeared to be financial gain, as evidenced by the attempt to force Gretchen to withdraw money. However, the escalation to violence, particularly the fatal stabbing, suggested a willingness to use lethal force when the plan was thwarted. The randomness and brutality of the attack contributed to the case's notoriety and left the community feeling vulnerable. The murder of a respected attorney in such a public and violent manner shocked the city. Local residents, many of whom knew Gretchen personally or professionally, were horrified, and the case received extensive media coverage. The fact that the perpetrator evaded capture in the immediate aftermath only heightened fears and frustration. After Gretchen's murder, law enforcement faced years of frustration as the case went cold. Despite the presence of witnesses and the collection of some physical evidence at the scene, including a distinctive paisley hat believed to have been worn by the assailant, investigators were unable to identify a suspect. The randomness and brutality of the attack, combined with the absence of any clear connection between Gretchen and her killer, left the case shrouded in uncertainty. As the years passed, the Burford family and the broader community were left without closure. The critical breakthrough in the case came nearly 2 decades later, thanks to significant advancements in forensic DNA analysis. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement agencies across the country began to systematically re-examine cold cases using new DNA technologies. Biological evidence that had been preserved from the original investigation, most notably DNA found in the hat left at the crime scene, was now amenable to analysis at a level of precision that had not been possible in 1988. In 2005, police submitted the DNA evidence from the hat to a national database. This time, the results yielded a match. The DNA profile corresponded to Tyrone Hommel, a man who was already incarcerated in Texas for unrelated offenses. The match was definitive, providing investigators with the first concrete lead in the case since the night of the murder. With the DNA match in hand, investigators revisited the details of the crime. They were able to reconstruct the sequence of events with greater confidence now that they knew the identity of the perpetrator. The evidence supported the theory that Tyrone had targeted Gretchen at random. The DNA evidence from the hat, combined with witness statements and the timeline established by ATM records, provided a compelling narrative that linked Tyrone to the crime beyond reasonable doubt. Once the DNA match was confirmed, authorities moved to formally charge Tyrone with the murder. Because he was already serving a sentence in Texas, arrangements were made to transfer him to California to face trial. The case against Tyrone was strong. In January 2008, he confessed to the murder, providing details that were consistent with the evidence collected at the scene. His confession was not the product of coercion or a plea bargain, rather it was a straightforward admission of guilt in the face of overwhelming forensic proof. Tyrone pleaded guilty to the charge of murder, sparing the Burford family the ordeal of a lengthy trial. Gregory Richard Barker, often referred to as the Singles Bar Killer, is a convicted murderer and armed robber whose criminal activities spanned the 1980s and early 1990s. His case attracted national attention due to the brutality of his crimes, but he was eventually captured with the assistance of televised crime programs. The incident we're going to discuss also involved Hilda Amelia Roach, a 45-year-old administrative assistant living in Montclair, Virginia at the time of her murder in early April 1982. Known among friends and colleagues as a cautious yet sociable woman, Hilda enjoyed meeting new people and often visited singles bars in Washington, D.C. She had recently moved into a townhouse in the Lake Ridge area, a quiet and well-regarded suburban community. Those who knew her described her as independent and reserved, with no known enemies. On the evening of April 1st, 1982, she went out to a singles bar where she met Gregory Barker. Barker introduced himself as Alex Graham, claiming to be a government contractor who had just relocated from Florida. He told Hilda he was living at the Oakwood Apartments in Alexandria, Virginia, and presented himself as a man of means, even driving a luxury car that caught her attention. Friends later recalled Hilda mentioning Barker's apparent wealth, but they also warned her to be cautious, noting that appearances could be deceiving and identities easily fabricated. Late that night, Hilda returned to her townhouse around 11:30 p.m. Barker accompanied her, allegedly, to return a wallet she had misplaced earlier in the evening. Forensic evidence would later reveal that a violent struggle took place in her living room. The room showed clear signs of a confrontation. Furniture was overturned, and Hilda's wallet was found discarded on the floor. The struggle moved from the living room to her bedroom, where investigators found her clothing torn off. Adhesive tape residue was discovered on her wrists, indicating she had been bound. It was in this room that Barker sexually assaulted her, a detail confirmed by forensic analysis. After the assault, Barker forced Hilda into the trunk of his car. Investigators later found a distinctive shoe print inside the trunk, which would become a crucial piece of evidence linking Barker to the crime. He then drove her approximately 9 miles to a wooded area behind John F. Patty Elementary School in Montclair. There, he led her about 150 feet into the woods. In a chilling act of violence, Barker shot Hilda once in the back of the head with a .38 caliber revolver. The bullet entered at a downward angle consistent with an execution-style killing. Her body, partially nude and with her hands bound behind her back, was discovered by a school custodian at 7:15 a.m. the following morning. She was found lying face up with her legs spread apart. The investigation into the murder was meticulous and relied heavily on forensic science. At her townhouse, police documented the overturned furniture and scattered belongings, as well as adhesive tape fragments and a partial fingerprint on a nightstand in her bedroom. The absence of forced entry suggested that Hilda had willingly let her attacker into her home, reinforcing the theory that she had known Barker, at least superficially, from their encounter earlier that evening. At the wooded crime scene, investigators noted that the soil and leaf litter found on Hilda's body matched samples taken from Barker's car trunk. The bullet recovered from her skull was consistent with a .38 caliber revolver, though the weapon itself was never located. A major breakthrough in the case came several months later in July 1982 when a restaurant manager who had interacted with Barker agreed to undergo hypnosis to recall details about the phone number Barker had provided. Under hypnosis, the manager was able to recall part of the number, which detectives cross-referenced with lease records at Oakwood Apartments. This led them to Barker, who had vacated his apartment only days after the murder. Further investigation revealed that the partial fingerprint found in Hilda's bedroom matched Barker's military records, definitively placing him at the scene. The shoe print found in his car trunk also matched impressions at the abduction site, providing another direct link to the crime. Additionally, witnesses played a significant role in piecing together the timeline of events. Neighbors reported seeing a man matching Barker's description at Hilda's townhouse late that night, and one specifically remembered a luxury vehicle parked outside around midnight. These accounts helped corroborate the forensic timeline and supported the prosecution's case that Barker had targeted Hilda after meeting her at the singles bar. Barker's psychological profile added another layer of complexity to the investigation. A Vietnam veteran and former Army intelligence officer, Barker was known for adopting false identities and impersonating government agents. Detectives theorized that he used these fabricated personas to gain the trust of his victims, employing tactics inspired by spy fiction. His modus operandi involved targeting single women in social settings, presenting himself as affluent and trustworthy, and using rented vehicles to reinforce his fabricated identity. While Barker was typically careful to avoid leaving forensic evidence, such as wearing gloves during his later robberies, he was less careful in Hilda's case, leaving behind fingerprints and other traces that would ultimately lead to his conviction. Following the murder, between December 1983 and March 1984, Barker moved to Las Vegas, where he executed 3 armed bank robberies. Unlike his earlier violent offenses, Barker's approach to these robberies was a lot less direct and placed an emphasis on psychological intimidation. In each instance, Barker entered the bank alone, dressed in a manner that would not draw undue attention. He approached the teller with a note demanding cash, a tactic designed to avoid drawing the attention of other customers or security personnel. The notes were succinct but threatening, making it clear that he was armed and willing to use force if necessary. However, Barker rarely displayed a weapon openly, relying instead on the implied threat to compel compliance. This approach minimized the likelihood of immediate resistance or intervention by bank staff or patrons. Barker's demeanor during the robberies was calm and controlled. Witnesses later described him as polite but firm, never raising his voice or displaying overt aggression. This composure contributed to the initial difficulty in identifying him, as he left little impression beyond the immediate fear induced by the robbery itself. In total, Barker managed to steal approximately $80,000 in today's money adjusted for inflation. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department quickly recognized that the robberies were likely the work of a single individual, given the similarities in method and the close timing of the crimes. Surveillance footage, while grainy and inconclusive, suggested a man in his late 30s to early 40s, of average build, who took care to obscure his features and avoid leaving physical evidence. The use of demand notes rather than overt violence further complicated efforts to develop a clear suspect profile. A key development in the investigation came when one of the tellers, Tamori, provided a detailed description of the robber's appearance and mannerisms. Although Tamori was unable to identify Barker in a live lineup shortly after the robberies, he later positively identified Barker from a photographic lineup presented during the federal investigation. This identification became a focal point of Barker's later appeals, as his defense argued that the process was improper because his counsel was not present and he had not been notified of the identification before trial. Despite these objections, the court ruled that the identification was admissible, noting that the teller's initial inability to identify Barker in person did not preclude a subsequent positive identification from photographs. Forensic accounting also played a role in the investigation. Some of the stolen bills were traced to Barker's subsequent expenditures in the Las Vegas area, providing further circumstantial evidence of his involvement. Additionally, investigators discovered that he had failed to appear for a scheduled court hearing related to the robberies in 1984, prompting the issuance of a federal warrant for his arrest. This failure to appear marked the beginning of Barker's years as a fugitive, during which he continued to use aliases and move frequently to avoid detection. On March 25, 1991, at 12:03 p.m., Gregory Barker was arrested at his Phoenix workplace without incident. During his initial interrogation, he claimed that he was a government agent and that his arrest was part of a military cover-up. He insisted that everything he had done was part of covert government operations, a claim that investigators dismissed as another fabrication rooted in his long-standing pattern of deception. Following his arrest, Barker was extradited to Nevada, where he was tried and convicted on 3 counts of armed robbery, receiving a 20-year federal prison sentence. He was then extradited to Virginia to stand trial for the abduction and murder of Hilda Roach. In May 1992, Barker was convicted of both crimes and sentenced to 110 years in prison, with 50 years suspended, ensuring he would serve at least 60 years behind bars. Matthew Chase was a 22-year-old aspiring singer and actor who moved to Los Angeles from Medford, Oregon in pursuit of his dreams of stardom. He lived with his roommates Teresa and Steve Dahl, siblings who had also relocated from Oregon in the Pico Union area of downtown Los Angeles. This neighborhood choice would prove tragically significant, as the Pico Union district was experiencing some of the most intense gang violence in Los Angeles during the late 1980s. On the evening of June 8, 1988, Matthew returned home from dinner with Teresa at approximately 11:40 p.m. Upon arriving at their residence at 7800 Fountain Avenue, Matthew realized he had forgotten to deposit his paycheck. Despite the late hour, he decided to make the trip to a nearby ATM, located just 2 blocks from their home. Teresa made the decision to lend Matthew her car rather than letting him to walk as he typically would. She also asked him to pick up cat food on his way home. Matthew departed with only his paycheck and ATM card, leaving his wallet and driver's license behind, expecting it to be a quick errand. He successfully reached the ATM and deposited his paycheck, receiving some cash back in the process. However, approximately 30 minutes later, he returned to the same ATM and attempted to withdraw $280, an amount he knew exceeded both his account balance and daily withdrawal limit. When this transaction was declined due to insufficient funds, he immediately attempted to withdraw $200, which was also rejected. These deliberate attempts to withdraw amounts he knew were unavailable have been interpreted by investigators as potential distress signals, suggesting Matthew may have been under duress and trying to attract attention or trigger security protocols. 11 minutes after the failed withdrawals at the first ATM, Matthew's card was used at a different branch in another neighborhood. This ATM was equipped with a surveillance camera that captured the haunting image of Matthew standing at the machine with an unknown man positioned directly behind his right shoulder. The image clearly depicted the man hovering next to or slightly behind Matthew, presumably attempting to observe his PIN number. Police described the suspect as shorter than Matthew and chunkier in build. Over the following day and a half, 5 additional withdrawal attempts were made using Matthew's card. By this time, Matthew's deposited paycheck had cleared, allowing $400 to be successfully withdrawn from his account. The criminal activity continued until the ATM finally confiscated the card after multiple failed attempts. When Matthew failed to return home, Teresa and Steve became concerned. The siblings took matters into their own hands, with Steve calling the bank and impersonating Matthew to inquire about recent card activity. Using Matthew's personal information, including his social security number, they learned that the card had been used multiple times throughout the night. Armed with this information, they contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. However, the initial police response was inadequate. According to podcast sources, one detective in particular showed, quote, brazen, arrogant, and homophobic ignorance that prevented a missing persons report from being filed initially. It was only after Teresa was forced to file a false report claiming Matthew had stolen her car that the LAPD began to take action. When investigators examined Matthew's ATM card after it was confiscated by the machine, they found no fingerprints whatsoever. This suggested either the card had been meticulously wiped clean or the perpetrator had worn gloves throughout the encounter. On June 27, 1988, nearly 3 weeks after Matthew's disappearance, Teresa's abandoned car was discovered in close proximity to where he had vanished. The vehicle had been thoroughly cleaned of fingerprints. However, investigators found one crucial piece of evidence, a blue bandana that belonged to neither Matthew nor Teresa. The blue bandana found in the abandoned car bore the initials ESPBSCLS. Gang experts and investigators identified these markings as potentially linked to the Eastside Playboys gang. The timing of Matthew's disappearance coincided with one of the most violent periods in Los Angeles gang history. The city was experiencing what has been described as one of the worst gang wars ever to hit an American urban center. Law enforcement sources familiar with the Eastside Playboys described them as particularly violent. The gang was known to engage in systematic criminal activities, including forcing victims to withdraw money from multiple ATMs before killing them, a pattern that closely matched Matthew's case. Gang experts noted that the methodical nature of the crime, including the complete removal of fingerprints from both the ATM card and the vehicle, suggested the perpetrators were experienced criminals familiar with avoiding detection. However, some investigators and observers questioned whether the bandana might have been deliberately planted to mislead authorities, noting the contradiction between such careful evidence removal and leaving behind such an obvious gang identifier. On September 17, 1988, approximately 3 months after Matthew's disappearance, hikers discovered human remains in a ravine in nearby Pasadena. The body was severely decomposed, making visual identification nearly impossible. The coroner determined that the individual had been deceased for approximately 3 months, aligning with the timeline of Matthew's disappearance. The cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound to the head. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, it took until March 29, 1989, nearly 9 months after the discovery, for dental records to officially confirm the remains as those of Matthew Chase. However, despite confirming the identity of the victim, no one could pinpoint just who was responsible for the murder. Matthew's father, Frank Chase, maintained regular contact with investigators, following up weekly and pursuing his own leads. Tragically, Frank passed away on August 31, 2007 at the age of 67, never learning the identity of his son's killer. Matthew's sister subsequently continued her father's efforts to keep the case active. Fast forward to 2018, 30 years after Matthew's murder, the Los Angeles Police Department announced a major breakthrough in the case. Authorities identified David Bear Meza as Matthew's killer, who was believed to be around 20 years old at the time of the crime. David was also confirmed to have been a gang member when the murder occurred. The breakthrough came when David's girlfriend from the time of the crime came forward with information that implicated him in Matthew's murder. She possessed detailed knowledge of the crime that allowed investigators to close the case with confidence. Crucially, she was able to identify David as the man standing behind Matthew in the ATM surveillance footage. David was never brought to trial for the murder because he had been killed on June 10, 1988, just 2 days after Matthew's disappearance. He died in what was described as a drive-by shooting. On October 6, 1989, the small community of Noel, Missouri, population approximately 1,200, became the scene of one of the most shocking crimes in the region's history. The town was located in the southwestern corner of Missouri near the Oklahoma and Arkansas borders, and was a quiet rural area centered around poultry processing and tourism, where violent crimes were virtually unheard of. Dan Short, the 51-year-old president of the State Bank of Noel since 1983, was a respected community member who had taken on the challenging role of managing the bank during difficult economic times. Despite recently separating from his wife Joyce after 23 years of marriage, Short was described as a loving father to their 2 children and an active community participant who provided radio commentary for high school sporting events and wrote a weekly sports column for the local newspaper. The morning of October 6, 1989 began like any other day. Assistant cashier Pauline Coonrod arrived at the bank at approximately 8:30 a.m. for her regular shift. As she approached the building, Pauline immediately noticed something amiss. The front doors to the bank were already unlocked. This was highly unusual as bank protocol required the doors to remain locked until official opening hours. Expecting to find Dan Short inside, having arrived early for work, Pauline entered the building calling out his name. However, as she walked through the usually pristine banking facility, she found no one inside. The silence was unsettling, and it quickly became apparent that something was seriously wrong. Within moments of her arrival, Pauline realized what had happened. The bank had been robbed during the night. The bank's interior showed clear signs of being sifted through, yet the perpetrators had been careful not to leave obvious evidence of forced entry. The usually orderly banking floor was in disarray, with overturned empty teller drawers scattered about. More concerning was the discovery of empty bullet casings strewn underneath the bank's lone surveillance camera. The camera had been deliberately disabled through multiple methods. First, the lens had been spray painted black to obscure its view, and then in what investigators would later describe as an act of overkill, the camera had been shot out using a .45 caliber handgun. Spent shell casings found beneath the camera confirmed that the robbers had fired at least 2 shots to ensure the surveillance system was completely disabled. Furthermore, the vault keys, which were normally kept secure in a desk drawer, were found hanging in the vault door itself. This detail would prove crucial to investigators, as it suggested that someone with intimate knowledge of the bank's operations had either willingly provided access or had been coerced into opening the vault. Over $70,000 had been stolen from the bank's vault, but the selection of what was taken raised immediate questions about the perpetrator's experience and motivations. Most unusually for a bank robbery, the thieves had focused heavily on coins, stealing approximately 320 pounds of quarters, dimes, and nickels, rolled coins that would have been extremely heavy and cumbersome to transport. This choice struck investigators as particularly amateurish, as seasoned bank robbers typically focused on paper currency for obvious reasons. Even more puzzling was what the robbers had left behind. More than $100,000 in bills sitting in an unlocked drawer, completely accessible and untouched. This discovery reinforced the FBI's initial assessment that they were dealing with amateur criminals rather than experienced bank robbers. More alarming than the stolen money was the missing Dan Short. The bank president was conspicuously absent from the crime scene and had not arrived for work that morning. Short was one of only 4 bank employees who had access to the vault and its time lock mechanism, making his disappearance particularly significant to the investigation. Bank Vice President Mark Allman provided crucial context to investigators about Short's work habits and the events leading up to the robbery. He revealed that Short had intended to work late the evening before and had deliberately disabled the time lock on the vault, putting it on standby mode so he could return later that evening and manually open the vault if needed. This was not entirely unusual behavior for Short, who was known to work late evenings at various times during the week. The fact that the time lock had not been set on the night of the robbery meant that whoever had access to the vault keys and combination could open it at any time, rather than waiting for the time lock to automatically release during business hours. Upon discovering the robbery, Pauline immediately contacted local authorities. But since the bank was insured by the FDIC, the FBI was automatically called in to investigate. As investigators processed the crime scene, the search for Dan Short became their most urgent priority. The McDonald County Sheriff drove directly to Short's home in rural Arkansas near the Missouri border to check on the bank president's welfare. However, upon arriving at Short's residence, the sheriff found the house empty and Short's distinctive red pickup truck missing from the property. His absence immediately raised multiple scenarios in investigators' minds. FBI agent Liddell Farley, a 19-year veteran who had become the lead investigator on the case, later recalled that at the end of the first day, they weren't certain whether they were dealing with an abducted banker or whether Short himself had left with the money. This uncertainty would persist for several crucial days as the investigation developed. The first major break in the case came within hours of the initial discovery. An employee at Sibley Manufacturing, located just outside of town, contacted investigators to report a red pickup truck that had been abandoned in the factory parking lot. The vehicle was quickly identified as belonging to Dan Short. The condition and contents of the abandoned truck provided investigators with their first concrete clues about what had happened to the missing man. Scattered across the truck bed were coin wrappers and 7 rolls of pennies, clear evidence linking the vehicle to the bank robbery. The presence of the coins suggested that Short's truck had been used in the transportation of the stolen money, but whether Short had been a willing participant or a victim remained unclear. Investigators thoroughly dusted the truck for fingerprints, hoping to find evidence of the perpetrators who had handled the vehicle. However, only Short's own fingerprints were identified on the truck, providing no immediate leads to other suspects. Despite the extensive search efforts involving multiple agencies and substantial resources, the first 5 days after the crime yielded no trace of Short. As the search area expanded and still produced no results, investigators began to fear that he might have been taken much farther than initially anticipated or that he might already be dead. The breakthrough in the search came on October 11th, 1989, 5 days after the bank robbery, when a couple fishing for bass on Grand Lake of the Cherokees in Oklahoma made a horrifying discovery. The lake, located approximately 20 miles out of town, was a popular fishing destination that stretched for 66 miles and covered over 46,000 acres of water in the Ozark Mountains of northeastern Oklahoma. The couple reported finding a man's body floating in the water not far from the Cowskin Bridge, and FBI agents immediately rushed to the scene. The male victim was still bound by gray duct tape to a wooden spindle-back chair that had been weighted down with a concrete block and a chain hoist. The discovery was particularly disturbing because of the elaborate apparatus used to submerge Short's body. Investigators found that the combined weight of Short, the chair, the chain hoist, and the concrete block exceeded 250 pounds, leading them to conclude that more than one person would have been required to lift Short over the 3-foot railing on the bridge. Dr. Robert Hemphill, a medical examiner, was called to the scene to examine the body and conduct the formal identification process. After conducting an autopsy and reviewing Short's dental records, he determined conclusively that the body was that of Dan Short. The medical examiner submitted a death certificate that listed drowning as the cause of death. Shortly after the discovery of Short's body, the FBI received a tip that completely altered the investigation. We were getting hundreds of calls, but there was an anonymous phone call about the Agofsky brothers, recalled one investigator. The caller claimed that two local brothers, Joe and Shannon Agofsky, were bragging about stealing a large amount of coins in a recent crime. Prior to this tip, the Agofsky brothers had not been considered suspects. When investigators began looking into the two men, they discovered that both had no prior criminal records. Joe Agofsky was 23 years old at the time of the crime, while his younger brother Shannon was just 18, and both were relatively well known in the small community. It was said that Joe was more reserved, while Shannon was much more abrasive and cocky. The brothers' financial background initially seemed to contradict a motive for robbery. 9 years before the crime, their father had died in a plane crash, and the family had received a substantial insurance settlement. This financial cushion initially led investigators to question why the brothers would need to commit a bank robbery. However, as FBI agent Ladell Farley dug deeper into their finances, a different picture emerged. The family had basically spent all of the insurance money, with only Shannon still having his. However, he was not able to access that money until the age of 21. Both brothers were brought in for questioning separately, and their initial cooperation with authorities would later be contrasted with their subsequent behavior as the investigation progressed. During his first interview, Joe told investigators that on the night of the robbery, he had been at his girlfriend's house more than 40 miles away in Joplin, Missouri. When asked about firearms, he said he owned two .45 caliber handguns, the same caliber as the weapon used at the bank. Joe readily agreed to let investigators test fire his weapons and directed them to his home where the guns were stored, telling them his younger brother Shannon would be there to meet them. When agents arrived at Joe's residence, Shannon showed them where the guns were kept and cooperated with their request to take the weapons for testing. Shannon provided his own alibi for the night of the crime, stating that he was at his mother's house where he was living at. He also claimed to have attended a martial arts class at the local dojo earlier that evening, which both his karate instructor and mother reportedly confirmed. After test firing Joe's handguns, agents sent the shell casings to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. Examiners later determined that the casings did not match those found at the bank, which initially appeared to clear the brothers of suspicion related to the shooting of the camera. Despite initially moving on to other suspects, the investigation circled back to the brothers when a crucial piece of evidence, the chain hoist used in Dan Short's murder, was linked to them through an unexpected source. Agent Farley received a call from a man who claimed his friend might have information about the chain hoist. The friend was named Wayne Butane, and he coincidentally had lost his hoist after it had been stolen. When shown photographs of the hoist recovered from Grand Lake, Wayne confirmed that it was his through the damage that he caused to the pulley. The chain hoist evidence became even more significant when investigators questioned the Agofsky family about it. According to Wayne, he last saw the device at the brothers' mom's residence. When questioned about the missing chain hoist, Sheila Agofsky claimed to have no memory of it, while maintaining that Shannon was at her house the night of the murder. When Joe was asked about the hoist, he stated that he saw it at his mother's place. However, Shannon outright said that he had never seen the device before. As the investigation progressed, officials looked deeper into the brothers' financial activities. Despite neither of them having steady employment, investigators discovered suspicious spending patterns that suggested a sudden influx of cash. They had made cash purchases on cars despite not having a source to fund such items. Shannon in particular had spent about $5,000 since the date of the robbery. For Joe, the financial evidence was even more substantial. He had spent about $19,000 in the same window of time. With mounting suspicions but still lacking definitive evidence, investigators decided to subject Shannon to a polygraph examination in late 1989. Ultimately, he failed. The failed test, while not admissible as evidence in court, reinforced investigators' focus on Shannon as a primary suspect and motivated them to pursue additional evidence that could definitively link him to the crime. In December 1989, approximately 2 months after the bank robbery and murder, the Agofsky brothers and their mother were subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury to answer questions under oath. While this was happening, analysts discovered fingerprints on the duct tape used to bind Short. These prints were later linked to Shannon. But despite having this direct link, officials still felt that this was not enough to convict both brothers. That's when Gant Sanders comes in, a friend of both brothers who initially refused to cooperate with the investigation. Sanders had been on investigators' radar early in the case. Despite multiple interviews in which Sanders maintained the brothers' innocence, Agent Farley remained convinced that he knew more than he was revealing. Sanders was presented with a choice. If he was innocent but had knowledge of the crime, he should cooperate. If he was knowingly protecting the brothers and they were convicted, Sanders could be charged with aiding and abetting, and without a solid alibi, he remained under suspicion himself. So in June 1990, nearly 8 months after the crime, Sanders finally contacted officials hoping to clear his name. Although Sanders continued to deny any involvement in the bank robbery and murder, he provided crucial information about other criminal activities involving the brothers, including a December 1989 burglary in which they stole several rifles and subsequently sold them across state lines in Arkansas. More significantly for the Dan Short case, Sanders revealed conversations that suggested the brothers had been planning a bank robbery similar to the one that occurred. Only 1 month before the robbery, he said that Joe had inquired with him about the availability of bank blueprints prepared by Sanders' father during a past remodeling of the bank. Sanders also described a conversation about the possible kidnapping of a man. He added that he and the brothers also identified a banker in Joplin and followed him home. They had planned to take him to the bank and force him to open the vault. Additionally, Shannon had also discussed possibly driving a tow truck through the walls of a bank and if it would be strong enough to knock down concrete walls. As the case against the brothers mounted, one key witness named Carol Dryden came forward to report some suspicious behavior. Carol was a neighbor of Short's and stated that on the night of October 6, 1989, around 2 a.m. on the morning of the robbery, she had seen multiple vehicle headlights turning into Short's driveway. Approximately 15 to 20 minutes later, she observed the same lights leaving the property. This timeline proved crucial to establishing when Short had been abducted. Several other witnesses also said that they witnessed the same event occur around the same time. In September 1992, nearly 3 years after the crime, both Shannon and Joe were tried in federal court. The evidence was sufficient to convince a jury to convict both brothers on 3 federal charges: conspiracy to rob a federally insured bank, aggravated armed robbery of a federally insured bank, and use of a firearm during the commission of a federal crime. Each received a life imprisonment plus 5 years. In a separate state trial in Oklahoma for Dan Short's murder, Shannon was convicted, but Joe's trial ended in a mistrial. Shannon's criminal activities did not end with the Dan Short case. In 2004, while serving his life sentence for the bank robbery and murder, he was convicted of brutally beating and stomping fellow inmate Luther Plant to death in a prison recreation area at a federal facility in Orange, Texas. This act earned him a federal death sentence. Luther Plant, who was 37 years old at the time of his death, was in his 8th year of serving a 15-year term for arson and firearms violations related to the 1987 burning of a Texas nightclub. In a significant development on December 23, 2024, former President Joe Biden commuted Shannon's death sentence to life in prison without parole as part of a broader commutation of 37 federal death sentences. However, in an unusual turn of events, Shannon refused to accept the commutation, filing court documents arguing that losing his death sentence would hurt his ongoing legal appeals. He maintains his innocence and believes that the commutation would make it more difficult for him to prove his claims in court, as death penalty cases receive heightened scrutiny compared to life sentence cases. As for Joe, he died in federal prison in North Carolina on March 5, 2013, while serving his life sentence. The case of Donald Eugene Webb spanned nearly 4 decades and culminated in the discovery of one of the FBI's most notorious fugitives buried in his own wife's backyard. Webb, a career criminal with ties to organized crime, became infamous for the brutal murder of Pennsylvania Police Chief Gregory Adams in 1980, subsequently eluding capture for 37 years through an elaborate scheme orchestrated by his devoted wife. Donald Webb was born Donald Eugene Perkins on July 14th, 1931 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Raised by his paternal grandfather after his birth parents were unable to care for him, Webb's early life showed signs of the criminal path he would later follow. His military service ended in disgrace when he received a dishonorable discharge from the United States Navy, setting the stage for a life outside the law. In 1956, Webb legally changed his name from Donald Eugene Perkins to Donald Eugene Webb in Bristol County, Massachusetts. This name change marked the beginning of his mastery of assuming new identities. He established himself as a sophisticated career criminal specializing in jewelry store burglaries. His criminal record was extensive, including convictions for burglary, possession of counterfeit money, possession of weapons and dangerous instruments, breaking and entering, armed bank robbery, grand larceny, and car theft. During the mid-1970s, Webb served a 2-year prison term in New York State Prison, an experience that only reinforced his determination never to return to incarceration. This resolve would prove fatal for Police Chief Gregory Adams years later. The FBI identified him as an associate of the Patriarcha crime family, the dominant organized crime group in New England based in Providence, Rhode Island. Through these connections, Webb operated an extensive criminal enterprise that involved robbing banks, jewelry stores, and high-end hotels up and down the East Coast. The stolen goods were fenced through the mob in Providence, creating a profitable and seemingly sustainable criminal operation. He also maintained connections with organized crime outfits in the Miami area where he would fence additional stolen goods. His associates included members of what law enforcement termed the Fall River Gang, a loose confederation of criminals based in southeastern Massachusetts. He used numerous aliases throughout his criminal career, including A.D. Baker, Donald Pierce, John S. Portis, Stanley Portis, Bev Webb, Eugene Webb, and Stanley Webb. Additionally, he worked various legitimate jobs as cover for his criminal activities, including positions as a butcher, salesman, restaurant manager, and vending machine repairman. In 1979, Webb's criminal activities escalated when he and 2 accomplices allegedly burglarized suburban Albany homes while posing as sewer and water inspectors. Webb and Frank Joseph Locke, one of his accomplices, were arrested in Colony, New York, and charged with attempted burglary. The legal system's failure to contain Webb at this crucial moment would have tragic consequences. After their bails were posted, Webb's being set at $35,000, both men failed to appear at their December 1979 court date, making Webb a federal fugitive. This failure to appear warrant meant that when Police Chief Adams stopped Webb nearly a year later, the stakes could not have been higher for the criminal who had vowed never to return to prison. On December 4th, 1980, at approximately 3 p.m., Police Chief Gregory Blaze Adams of Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, made what appeared to be a routine traffic stop. The 31-year-old chief, a 9-year veteran of law enforcement and former U.S. Marine Corps veteran, had moved to the small Pennsylvania town seeking quieter police work after experiencing the violence of urban policing in Washington, D.C. Chief Adams observed Webb's vehicle speeding past a stop sign on Water Street and pursued him, catching up as Webb attempted to turn around in the parking lot of the Agway feed store on Butler Street. Adams positioned his patrol car to block the exit of the parking lot and approached the driver's side door of Webb's vehicle. When Adams requested Webb's driver's license, the fugitive provided fraudulent documents, including a New Jersey driver's license bearing the name Stanley Portis, an alias he had assumed from his wife Lillian's deceased first husband, who had died in 1948. Rather than comply with the traffic stop, Webb made a fatal decision. He drew a .25 caliber Colt pistol and shot Adams. The confrontation quickly escalated into a brutal struggle. Chief Adams, despite being shot, managed to return fire with his service revolver, though his shots were not immediately fatal to Webb. Webb then exited his vehicle and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the wounded police chief. During the struggle, Webb disarmed Adams and began pistol whipping him with the chief's own revolver, striking him repeatedly in the head and face, causing deep wounds that left Adams almost unrecognizable. Witnesses to the shooting heard a total of 5 gunshots. Chief Adams was shot twice at close range, once in the arm and once in the chest, with one bullet collapsing his lung and another tearing through the bottom of his heart. Despite being mortally wounded, Adams continued to fight back. He inflicted severe injuries on his attacker that would haunt Webb for the rest of his life. Adams broke Webb's leg in what prosecutors described as a compound fracture and somehow managed to rip off Webb's lower lip during the struggle. After brutally beating Adams, Webb ran to the patrol car, ripped out its radio microphone, and took the keys before fleeing the scene in his own rental vehicle. Adams's service revolver was later discovered approximately 7 miles away along Corn Planter Road in Winfield Township, Pennsylvania, with all 6 bullets fired. A nearby resident found the mortally wounded Adams, who, despite his critical injuries, managed to tell her that he did not know his attacker and that he believed he was not going to survive. He lost consciousness on the way to the hospital and died of his injuries, leaving behind his wife Mary Ann Adams and their 2 young sons, Benjamin and Gregory Jr., both under the age of 2. The murder represented only the second homicide in Saxonburg's nearly 150-year history, with the first having occurred in 1842. Chief Adams was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery in Herman, Pennsylvania. Webb's white Mercury Cougar rental car was discovered on December 21, 1980 at a Howard Johnson's motel parking lot in Warwick, Rhode Island. The vehicle's location suggested that Webb had returned to the southeastern Massachusetts area of New England after the murder, consistent with his known criminal associations and residence patterns. Crucially, investigators found significant amounts of O-type blood under the steering wheel and on the seat and floorboard of the rental car. This blood evidence, which matched Webb's blood type, provided forensic confirmation that he had been severely wounded during his confrontation with Adams. A federal arrest warrant was issued for Webb on December 31, 1980, charging him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution after he was charged in Pennsylvania with first-degree murder for Chief Adams's slaying. On May 4, 1981, Webb was named as the 375th fugitive to be placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, beginning what would become one of the longest manhunts in American criminal history. The FBI's initial investigation focused on Webb's known associates and criminal connections. He had strong ties to Fall River and New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he lived with his wife Lillian and stepson. The last confirmed sighting of Webb occurred in July 1981, when an anonymous tipster reported seeing him in the New Bedford area. However, by the time FBI investigators arrived to follow up on the tip, Webb had vanished once again. In the years following Webb's disappearance, investigators received numerous unconfirmed sightings of Webb or men resembling him in Massachusetts, Washington, Canada, and Costa Rica. One of the most intriguing developments occurred in January 1990 when FBI Director William S. Sessions received a letter postmarked January 23rd, written by someone claiming to be Webb. The letter asked for forgiveness from Adams's family and suggested that the writer might surrender to authorities, but only if he could speak directly to John Walsh. host of the television show America's Most Wanted. Walsh featured the letter on his show, noting that FBI evidence technicians had examined it and believed it was authentic, though handwriting tests were inconclusive. On April 1st, 1990, a man claiming to be Webb called John Walsh, but when asked questions to confirm his identity, he was unable to name two of Webb's closest relatives. The call was dismissed as an April Fool's joke, leaving investigators no closer to capturing their fugitive. The true story of Webb's life as a fugitive would not emerge until decades later, revealing a story far more shocking than investigators had imagined. After fleeing the murder scene, Webb drove directly back to Massachusetts, where he sought medical treatment for his severe injuries. Using the alias John, he spent a full month at Toby Hospital in Wareham, receiving treatment for his compound leg fracture. The extent of Webb's injuries from his confrontation with Adams proved to be life-altering. His broken leg never healed properly, leaving him permanently disabled and requiring him to walk with a cane for the rest of his life. The disfigurement to his face, where his lower lip had been ripped off, also left him permanently scarred. Rather than fleeing the country or hiding in remote locations as investigators theorized, Webb spent his entire life as a fugitive, living in plain sight in Massachusetts, hidden in his own homes with the help of his wife, Lillian. After his release from the hospital, Webb moved into a house in New Bedford with Lillian, where a secret room had been constructed in the basement. The hidden room was designed to look like a regular wall and could be locked from the inside. It was approximately the size of a shower stall and contained only a stool and his walking cane. When visitors came to the house, Webb would hide in this secret room until they left, essentially living as a prisoner in his own home. In 1997, Lillian purchased a second home at 28 Maple Crest Drive in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, where another secret room was built in the basement. This room was even more sophisticated, featuring a system of hooks and locks that prevented anyone from accidentally opening the door. FBI documents noted that given Lillian's height, it would have been difficult for her to reach up and fasten the lock in the hidden room, suggesting that Webb was capable of securing himself inside. For 17 years, he lived in these basements, spending his days in darkness and permanent pain from his injuries. Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Chris Birkbichler observed that Webb, quote, pretty much lived like a dog, cowering in a basement as a coward for the rest of his life. During this period, investigators maintained surveillance on Lillian, noting that she sometimes wore wigs and changed her hair color, behaviors that suggested she was actively working to avoid detection. However, they never suspected that her husband was living directly under their noses. As Webb aged and his injuries took their toll, his health began to deteriorate significantly. In 1999, he suffered a massive stroke that left him unable to care for himself. Unable to seek medical treatment due to his fugitive status, his condition continued to worsen. Knowing that his death was approaching, Webb instructed his wife to dig a grave behind a backyard storage shed where he wanted to be buried. Lillian followed her husband's instructions, digging the hole in the frozen December soil. Just before New Year's 1999, Webb suffered a second stroke that proved fatal. True to her husband's wishes, Lillian placed Webb's body in a plastic container and buried him in the grave she had prepared. For the next 18 years, she maintained the secret of his death while investigators continued their search around the world. In 2015, the FBI's Boston Division launched an active cold case investigation into the Webb matter, marking a renewed commitment to solving the decades-old mystery. As part of this investigation, the FBI obtained newly acquired photographs of Webb taken during a cruise with his wife in July 1979. Approximately 1 year before he murdered Adams. On June 15, 2017, the FBI released these new color photographs, hoping they would generate new leads from the public. The breakthrough in the case came in November 2016, when the FBI executed a search warrant at 28 Maple Crest Drive. During the search, investigators discovered the sophisticated secret room in the basement. The room had not existed when Lillian purchased the home, and building permit records showed that the addition had been completed without proper authorization. Inside the hidden room, FBI agents found a black walking cane and 3 cardboard boxes of silver coins. When questioned about the cane, Lillian claimed she had never used it and knew nothing about it. Given Webb's known leg injury, investigators strongly suspected the cane belonged to the fugitive. The discovery of the silver coins was also significant significant, given Webb's history of burglaries and thefts. Additionally, agents discovered 42 photographs of Webb in the home, which were later released to the public as part of the renewed investigation. An accurate search of public records revealed that there was a landline at the address registered to Donald Webb, providing further evidence of his connection to the property. The investigation gained additional momentum when, on June 1st, 2017, Mary Jones, Adams's widow who had remarried, filed a lawsuit for civil damages against Donald Webb, his wife, and Webb's stepson Stanley. The lawsuit charged wrongful death and conspiracy in the 1980 murder of her first husband. This legal action created additional pressure on Lillian, who faced the prospect of both criminal prosecution for harboring a fugitive and significant civil liability. The combination of the FBI's renewed investigation and the civil lawsuit created circumstances that would finally force the truth to emerge. Lillian finally decided to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her lawyer, John Sicilline, whose uncle is currently a U.S. representative, contacted the FBI and announced that Lillian was willing to discuss what had happened to Webb. Pennsylvania authorities granted her immunity specifically for her cooperation in revealing Webb's location, though this immunity only covered Pennsylvania charges and did not shield her from potential federal prosecution. On July 13, 2017, Lillian led investigators to the exact spot where she had buried her husband 18 years earlier. Drawing a line in the dirt with her foot, she told police, "He's right there." The excavation revealed Webb's remains in a green Tupperware storage container along with a .22 caliber revolver. On July 17, 2017, the Massachusetts Office of the Chief Medical Examiner positively identified the remains as belonging to Donald Webb, officially ending the 37-year manhunt. As for Lillian, she was ultimately able to avoid all criminal prosecution and liability. She has largely stayed out of the public's view afterward. Janelle Matthews was born on February 9, 1972 to 13-year-old Terry Vieira at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California. The circumstances of her birth were obviously challenging as her biological mother was just a child herself. 6 weeks after her birth, Janelle was adopted by James, who is often referred to as Jim, and Gloria Matthews, who provided her with a loving home and family. She joined an older sister, Jennifer, at the family home, and several years later, the family relocated from California to Greeley, Colorado. Later on, Jim would become the principal of Platte Valley Elementary School in Kersey, Colorado. The Matthews family was deeply religious and actively involved in their local church, the Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene. They were described as a close-knit family who lived a very full life centered around their faith, community involvement, and children's activities. Janelle was described by her family as an athletic and talented child with a passion for singing and performing. Her love for music led her to join the Franklin Middle School Honor Choir, where she would regularly perform at school concerts and community events. This involvement in the choir would tragically place her at the Christmas concert on the night of her disappearance. On the evening of December 20th, 1984, just 5 days before Christmas, Janelle attended a Christmas concert at the Intra-West Bank of Denver as part of her middle school choir. The concert was a special holiday performance where she sang Jingle Bells with her fellow members. Jim was attending his older daughter Jennifer's basketball game, while Gloria was out of state caring for an ill family member. This left Janelle alone at home, a situation that would normally not have been considered dangerous in the safe community of Greeley. After the concert concluded, Janelle received a ride home from her friend Deanna Ross and Deanna's father, Russell Ross. They arrived at the Matthews residence at approximately 8:15 p.m. Russell waited until he saw Janelle turn on the lights inside the house before driving away, ensuring she had safely entered her home. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Janelle answered a phone call and took a message for her father. This phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Janelle. The message she took showed no indication of distress or danger. When Jim returned home from the basketball game at 9:30 p.m., he found the garage door open but no sign of Janelle. Her shoes and shawl were found near a heater in the family room, a place where she often lounged around. The television was still on, and there were signs that she had been having a normal evening at home. Jennifer arrived home at 10 p.m., but she had not seen Janelle and had no knowledge of her whereabouts. Initially, Jim thought his daughter might be at a friend's house, but after calling around and waiting for about an hour, he became increasingly concerned. The fact that her shoes were left behind was particularly troubling, as with snow on the ground, it was unlikely she would venture far without proper footwear. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Jim called the police. The Greeley Police Department responded quickly to the missing child report. Mayor John Gates, who was 27 years old at the time and serving as a police officer, was among those who responded to the scene. His assignment that night was to canvass the neighborhood, going door to door to ask residents if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. Unfortunately, no one in the neighborhood reported seeing or hearing anything unusual that evening. The only physical evidence discovered at the scene were footprints in the fresh snow outside the Matthews home. These footprints were found near the windows of the house, suggesting that someone had been looking inside. What made these footprints particularly significant was that someone had attempted to conceal them using a garden rake from the Matthews' own garage. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle inside the home. The house showed no evidence of violence or disturbance, which led investigators to believe that Janelle may have been lured outside or convinced to leave voluntarily. As is typical in missing child cases, law enforcement initially focused their investigation on family members. Jim himself became a suspect and was subjected to multiple polygraph tests. He underwent examination by what he described as the #1 interrogator west of the Mississippi, an FBI agent who told him he had failed the polygraph. Despite this setback, Jim continued to cooperate fully with the investigation, understanding that it was necessary to clear family members before expanding the search. A second polygraph test was administered by local police, and Jim eventually grew frustrated with the continued suspicion. He told investigators, "I have been very honest, I've been accessible to you anytime you wanted, but I'm getting sick of this because I am innocent." He was eventually cleared as a suspect, leaving investigators with no viable leads. With no physical evidence beyond the footprints and no viable suspects, the case quickly went cold. The investigation continued sporadically over the years, with periodic reviews and re-examinations of evidence, but no significant breakthroughs emerged. Janelle became one of the first missing children to be featured on milk cartons across America. The Missing Children Milk Carton program had just begun in late 1984, with the National Child Safety Council launching a nationwide coordinated effort in December 1984. The case garnered such national attention that President Ronald Reagan mentioned Janelle Matthews in a speech to the National Newspaper Association on March 7, 1985. In his remarks, Reagan said, "I learned about Janelle Matthews of Greeley, Colorado, who would have celebrated a happy 13th birthday with her family just last month. But 5 days before Christmas, Janelle disappeared from her home." In 1994, 10 years after the disappearance, the family made the difficult decision to hold a memorial service and have Janelle declared legally dead. The trauma of Janelle's disappearance eventually led the Matthews family to leave Greeley. About 2 years after the disappearance, they made the painful decision to pack up and move away from the community where they had built their lives. Jim explained the decision by saying, "You have to go on with life. You can't let this consume you." Despite the case going cold, law enforcement never completely abandoned the investigation. The Greeley Police Department periodically reviewed the case, and in 2015, they began a renewed inquiry into Janelle's disappearance. This renewed effort involved recontacting witnesses and applying the latest forensic advances to the investigation. Fast forward to July 23, 2019, a breakthrough occurred. Construction workers installing a pipeline in a remote area of Weld County, Colorado, discovered human remains. The workers were excavating at an intersection approximately 15 miles southeast of the Matthews family's former home. The remains were discovered at 4:50 p.m., leading to an immediate investigation. The Weld County Coroner's Office used DNA evidence to positively identify the remains as those of Janelle Matthews. The forensic report revealed that Janelle's cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, confirming that she had been murdered. Janelle was reportedly still wearing the same outfit she had worn on the night she disappeared, suggesting she had been killed shortly after her abduction. As you'd expect, the discovery of the remains was devastating for the family. Jennifer, Janelle's sister, said the family experienced some closure when they learned definitively that her sister was murdered. However, she also noted that discovering the remains brought a new type of grief as it confirmed their worst fears about what had happened. Now that Janelle was confirmed to have been murdered, the new question was who killed her. There were a handful of names that interested investigators, but the man we're going to discuss was named Stephen Dana Panky. Stephen was born and raised in the Midwest before moving to Colorado in the 1970s. In 1984, at the time of the disappearance, he was a 38-year-old man living in Greeley with his wife Angela Hicks and their young son. The family resided approximately 2 miles from the Matthews home. Stephen worked various jobs over the years, including as a security guard and used car salesman. He had a history of run-ins with law enforcement, mostly involving minor and non-violent allegations such as creating a nuisance and harassment. Notably, on December 19th, 1984, just one day before Janelle's disappearance, Stephen was arrested at a bank for harassment and criminal trespass. This arrest occurred after he argued with a bank teller and police were called to the scene. Both the Matthews family and the Panky family attended the same church. However, their connections to the church were different. While the Matthews family were active, well-regarded members of the community, Stephen had a more troubled history with the church. He had worked as a youth pastor and janitor at the church until being excommunicated in 1977 following an altercation with another congregant. The circumstances of his departure from the church were very significant as they involved allegations of assault by a woman he had been dating. While the charges were eventually dismissed after the woman asked for the case to be dropped, the incident led to his removal from the church. Jim, who joined the church after Stephen's departure, corrected some of the claims Stephen made about his role there. While Stephen claimed to have been a youth pastor, Jim clarified that he was not a youth worker at our church, he was the janitor. This discrepancy highlighted Stephen's tendency to embellish his role and importance in various situations. From the very beginning, Stephen's behavior following Janelle's disappearance was unusual and suspicious. According to his ex-wife Angela, on December 21st, 1984, just one day after the girl disappeared, Stephen announced that the family would be taking a sudden trip to California to visit his parents for Christmas. This announcement was particularly strange because Stephen had previously decided not to make the trip. Angela testified that Stephen told her to, quote, "Get us ready to go. We're leaving before daylight tomorrow morning to go to Big Bear for Christmas." The sudden nature of this trip, combined with its timing immediately after the disappearance, raised significant suspicions among investigators. During their trip to California, Stephen's behavior became even more concerning. Angela testified that her husband, who had previously forbidden radio and television use in their home, suddenly insisted that she turn on the radio during their drive back to Colorado. She said he was specifically searching for news about Janelle's disappearance, having her flip through stations for several hours looking for updates. Once they returned to Greeley, Stephen drove directly to a grocery store where he made Angela buy local newspapers. He then insisted that she read all the articles about Janelle's disappearance aloud to him, with Angela testifying that, quote, "He wanted me to read each article out loud to him, and I recall him having me read each one at least 3 times. One of the most damaging aspects of his behavior was his repeated attempts to insert himself into the investigation. About a month after the disappearance, Stephen contacted the Fort Collins FBI office claiming to have information about the case. He told agents, "I want to talk to you. It may or may not have something to do with the Janelle Matthews case." His story to the FBI involved a bizarre claim about his father-in-law who worked as a groundskeeper at a Greeley cemetery. Stephen alleged that 7 days after Janelle disappeared, his father-in-law told him that, quote, "A cop had contacted him and said that he had a body he wanted to be buried." This story was later revealed to be one of many lies Stephen told over the years. Throughout the decades that followed, Stephen continued to involve himself in the investigation. He repeatedly claimed to have additional knowledge of the crime and asked for immunity in exchange for information. The criminal indictment noted that he intentionally inserted himself in the investigation many times over the years, claiming to have knowledge of the crime, which grew inconsistent and incriminating over time. His claims included specific details about the crime scene that had not been released to the public. Most significantly, he claimed that on the evening of the abduction, a rake was used to cover up tracks left in the snow. This detail was particularly incriminating because only the Matthews family, investigators, and presumably the killer knew about the raked footprints. This obsession with the case extended to his legal troubles and court appearances. In 1999, he told the Idaho Supreme Court, after a conviction for causing a scene in a bank, that the conviction was in part an attempt to force him to become an informant in Janelle's disappearance. He also wrote that he feared he might get the death penalty for revealing the location of her body. After the trip, Angela stated that her husband continued his strange behavior. He spent hours digging holes in their yard, and during a church service where the pastor said he had heard a message from God that Janelle would be found alive, Stephen yelled "false prophet" and had to be removed from the church. Additionally, Angela said that at their son's funeral in 2008, Stephen became extremely emotional and said, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Janelle Matthews." Around 1986, approximately 2 years after Janelle's disappearance, Stephen and his family left Greeley and moved from state to state before eventually settling in Idaho in 1989. This move came at a time when the investigation into the case was still active, though it had begun to lose momentum. On September 4th, 2019, just weeks after the remains were discovered, police in Twin Falls, Idaho, executed a search warrant at Stephen's condo. The warrant stated that investigators had probable cause to believe that he abducted and murdered Janelle. Rather than remaining silent or cooperating quietly, Stephen immediately began giving interviews to media outlets. He spoke to CBS affiliate KMVT and other news organizations, proclaiming his innocence while simultaneously inserting himself further into the case. In one interview, he said, "I've never met Janelle Matthews. I've never met anybody in her family." He also claimed that he voluntarily gave DNA and offered to take a polygraph. However, when investigators actually tried to interview him in August prior to the raid, he immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer questions. On October 13th, 2020, a grand jury indicted Suspect Panky on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and false reporting in connection with Janelle Matthews' death. Stephen was 69 years old at the time of his indictment and was held without bail at the Ada County Jail in Boise until he was extradited to Colorado. Stephen's first trial began on October 14th, 2021 in Weld County, Colorado. The prosecution argued that Stephen's behavior and statements over the years incriminated him in the murder. The defense argued that his obsessive interest in the case could be attributed to Asperger's syndrome and that he was simply a true crime junkie who liked attention. The trial lasted several weeks and featured testimony from numerous witnesses, including Angela Hicks, law enforcement officers, and members of the Greeley community. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence as there was no physical evidence linking Stephen to the crime. This first trial ended in a mistrial in November of the same year. The second trial occurred in October of 2022, and Stephen was found guilty of first-degree felony murder, second-degree kidnapping, and false reporting. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. At the time of his sentencing, Stephen was 71 years old. On a warm summer morning in 1974, 12-year-old Leslie Metcalf was walking with her family through the Race Point Dunes of Provincetown when she made a horrific discovery. Initially mistaking the remains for a dead deer, the girl had found the naked body of a woman lying face down on a beach blanket in the dunes about 1 mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station inside the Cape Cod National Seashore. The crime scene was described as brutal. The victim had suffered devastating injuries. Her skull was crushed from blunt force trauma to the head. Her head was nearly severed from her body, and both hands had been completely removed. The deliberate removal of the hands was clearly intended to prevent identification through fingerprints, while several teeth had also been removed or knocked out. The body showed signs of assault that appeared to have occurred after death, and there was evidence that the killer had been lying next to the victim. The victim was estimated to have been dead for several weeks before discovery, with insect activity confirming this timeline. She had brownish-colored hair tied in a ponytail and pink-painted toenails. Investigators couldn't come to a precise age for the victim and instead placed her between 25 and 45 years old. Locals would go on to refer to the woman as the Lady of the Dunes. The case became particularly personal for Police Chief James Meads, who took charge of the investigation and became obsessed with solving it. Meads was known to carry the victim's skull in a duffel bag as he traveled, seeking identification and pursuing leads across the country. The investigation employed every available technique of its time and evolved with advancing technology. Initial efforts included neighborhood canvasses throughout the Cape Cod area and beyond, reviews of thousands of missing person cases from across the United States, clay model facial reconstructions created by forensic artists, age regression drawings showing what the victim might have looked like at different ages, and dental record comparisons with missing persons databases. Multiple exhumations were conducted in 1980, 2000, and 2013, each time hoping that advancing forensic techniques might yield new clues. Over the decades, numerous theories popped up about both the victim's identity and her killer. One of the most persistent early leads involved Rory Jean Kessinger, a 24-year-old alleged gun runner and substance smuggler who had escaped from Plymouth County Jail on May 27, 1974, just 2 months before the body's discovery. However, DNA comparison during the 2000 exhumation definitively ruled out Kessinger as being the victim. The case also generated speculation about connections to organized crime, particularly due to the professional nature of the hand removal, which led some to suspect a connection to Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger. Another theory that gained significant attention was proposed by horror writer Joe Hill, son of Stephen King, who suggested in 2018 that the victim might have been an extra in the 1975 film Jaws, which was being filmed in the area around the time of the murder. This theory was never substantiated, but added to the public fascination with the case. The case remained cold until 2022 when the FBI partnered with Othram Labs, a Texas-based forensic genealogy company specializing in extracting DNA from degraded samples. Ultimately, they were able to generate a DNA profile despite the extensive damage and contamination of the samples. On October 31, 2022, the FBI announced the identification of the Lady of the Dunes as Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old woman from Tennessee. Ruth was born on September 8, 1936 in Whitwell, Tennessee, to Johnny and Eva Terry. Her early life was said to be difficult, including the death of her mother at age 23. In 1957, following a brief marriage, Ruth left Tennessee to work at the Fisher Body Automotive Plant in Livonia, Michigan. In 1958, she gave birth to a son named Richard, but financial difficulties prevented her from caring for him. She made the difficult decision to allow the superintendent of her workplace, Richard Hanchett Sr., to adopt her son in exchange for paying off her expenses. After the adoption was finalized, Ruth moved to California. She maintained some contact with her family over the years and in 1972 reached out to her son Richard, though he wasn't ready to meet her at the time due to personal struggles. The investigation revealed that Ruth had ties to California, Massachusetts, and Michigan. On February 16, 1974, just 4 months before her death, she married an antiques dealer named Guy Rockwell Moldavin in Reno, Nevada. The couple visited Ruth's family in Tennessee in the spring of 1974, which would be the last time her relatives saw her alive. During this visit, her family noticed concerning changes in her behavior. Her grandniece Brittany Novangloski later recalled that Ruth wasn't herself whenever she was with Guy, who exhibited possessive behavior. The couple told Ruth's family they were planning to travel across the United States looking for antiques, and they specifically mentioned visiting Massachusetts as they were leaving. Following the identification, investigators quickly focused on her husband, Guy, as the prime suspect. On August 28, 2023, Cape and Islands District Attorney Robert J. Galliboy officially announced that Guy was responsible for Ruth's death. The evidence linking him to the murder was compelling. Guy was the last person to see Ruth alive during their summer 1974 honeymoon trip. When he returned from the trip, he was driving what was believed to be Ruth's car. He told witnesses that Ruth had passed away and later claimed they had fought during their honeymoon and he hadn't heard from her again. Investigation into Guy's background revealed a disturbing pattern of violence against women. Born in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1923, he was described as a charming rascal with the gift of gab, who had been married at least 5 times. 14 years before marrying Ruth, Guy was the prime suspect in the disappearance and presumed murder of his second wife, Manzanita Aileen Ryan, aged 40, and her 18-year-old daughter, Dolores Ann Mearns. The pair disappeared on April 1st, 1960, and were reported missing when they failed to make their regular monthly trip to Vancouver to visit Manzanita's ex-husband. In July 1960, Guy divorced Manzanita for desertion and immediately married his third wife, Evelyn Emerson. 5 days after this marriage, Emerson's stepmother gave Guy a cashier's check for $10,000 to buy antiques for resale in Canada. Both Guy and the money subsequently vanished. When police investigated the Seattle home where Guy had lived with Manzanita and Dolores, they made a dark discovery. In August 1960, authorities found bits of human tissue and pieces of human body in a newly sealed septic tank. Additional evidence was found in the attic, including teeth, human blood, and other signs of violent crime. Some limbs were also found floating in the Columbia River. Guy was eventually arrested in New York City's Greenwich Village after a nationwide manhunt. Despite being questioned for 2 weeks about the disappearances, he never confessed, and apparently lacking sufficient evidence, prosecutors were unable to charge him with murder. He was convicted only of grand larceny for stealing money from his third wife's family and served time in prison before being released in 1962. Media reports described Guy as a sometimes actor and DJ in California, an antiques dealer in Seattle, and a bunco artist and great lover everywhere he went. The New York Daily News reported that by 1960, he had 3 wives and many sweethearts, and was known around Greenwich Village for his nightly soirees with beatniks, art lovers, celebrities, and celebrity hunters, all bound by Guy's magnetism and offbeat philosophy. After Ruth's death, he wrote a cookbook titled Cooking with Rump Oil that appeared to contain subtle references to his crimes. One recipe called Cape Cod Shid featured a strange drawing of a creature with long, wavy hair, similar to Ruth's hairstyle. The accompanying text read, "Out of the water and into the pan. The sweet turpentine taste will turn to that of a burnt glove, and the tender look will become one of despair." Despite being a suspect in multiple murders, Guy continued to evade justice and build relationships on the West Coast. He married his 5th wife, Phyllis Smurl, who was listed as his widow in his 2002 obituary. He spent his final years working as a radio talk show host and died in 2002 at age 78 after a lengthy illness, 20 years before Ruth's identification. The official closure of the Lady of the Dunes case in August 2023 provided long-awaited answers to a mystery that had stood for nearly 50 years. However, the resolution came with significant limitations. Guy's death in 2002 meant that he would never face trial for his crimes, robbing Ruth's family of the opportunity to see justice served in court. "I wish he was still alive so he could face what he did," said Ruth's son, Richard Hanchett. Richard expressed both relief at finally knowing what had happened to his mother and frustration that her killer had escaped justice. Bonnie Craig was born on March 30th, 1976 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Her early life was shaped by frequent moves, a result of her stepfather's career with BP Oil. The family relocated between cities such as Concord, California, Anchorage, Alaska, Midland, Texas, and Sugar Land, Texas, before finally settling in Anchorage during Bonnie's teenage years. Despite the instability, Bonnie excelled both academically and socially. She attended Hanshu Junior High and Robert Service High School in Anchorage, where she stood out for her involvement in various activities. She played violin and viola in the school orchestra, coached youth swimming and diving, and made a significant impact by founding a chapter of Students Against Drunk Driving after losing a close friend, Katie Garcia, to a drunk driving accident. Bonnie's determination and courage were further demonstrated when she became the first girl to join her high school's wrestling team, motivated by a desire to challenge herself. In the fall of 1994, Bonnie began her freshman year at the University of Alaska Anchorage, where she planned to major in psychology. Friends and family described her as compassionate, fiercely loyal, and academically driven. At the time, she was also maintaining a long-distance relationship with her boyfriend, who was stationed at a military base in Texas. On September 28, 1994, Bonnie's day began around 5 a.m. She left her family's home in South Anchorage to walk to a bus stop about 2.5 miles away, intending to catch an early bus to her English class at the university. In her backpack, she carried textbooks, a notebook, and an essay titled "Saying Goodbye," which she had written the night before. The essay poignantly reflected on her experiences with frequent moves and the emotional challenge of leaving friends behind, a detail that would later haunt her family. Two witnesses later recalled seeing a young woman matching Bonnie's description walking alone near Rabbit Creek Road in the early morning darkness, but no one saw her board a bus or arrive at her class. That afternoon at approximately 2:15 p.m., a hiker discovered Bonnie's body at McHugh Creek, a scenic but rugged area about 15 miles south of Anchorage. The body was partially submerged and lay at the base of a 30 to 40-foot cliff, surrounded by rocks stained with blood. Authorities quickly identified the victim as Bonnie Craig. The autopsy, conducted the next day, revealed that Bonnie had suffered 11 severe lacerations to the back of her skull, caused by blunt force trauma from a heavy object. There was also evidence of drowning and hypothermia, suggesting she may have still been alive when her body was dumped into the creek, though too injured to survive. The medical examiner found signs of sexual assault, including injuries consistent with forceful vaginal penetration and semen, which would later become crucial evidence. Defensive wounds, such as a fractured finger and bruises on her arms and hands, indicated that Bonnie had fought desperately for her life. The initial police investigation was fraught with challenges and missteps. At first, investigators considered the possibility that Bonnie's death was accidental, perhaps the result of a fall in the treacherous terrain of McHugh Creek. However, the autopsy findings, especially the pattern and severity of her injuries, quickly shifted the focus to homicide. Bonnie's mother, Karen Foster, became a vocal critic of the investigation, believing that detectives dismissed important leads too quickly. One theory which Foster supported was that Bonnie's murder might have been retaliation for her mother's undercover work with the Anchorage Police Department, where she had posed as a drug buyer to help arrest local dealers. An informant later claimed that a drug lord had targeted Bonnie to send a message to law enforcement, but this lead was never substantiated. Over the years, investigators pursued a number of suspects. Two of Bonnie's male co-workers at Sam's Club were scrutinized after reports that one had harassed her and accessed her personnel file to obtain her phone number. Both men provided DNA samples, but neither matched the semen found on Bonnie's body. Another lead involved a male classmate from Bonnie's English class who had written disturbing journal entries about September 28, 1994, describing violent fantasies. Despite the chilling content, no physical evidence linked him to the crime. The turning point came in 2006, thanks to the growing reach of the FBI's Combined DNA Index system. This national database allows law enforcement agencies across the United States to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with those of convicted offenders and arrestees. In the early 2000s, Alaska, like many other states, began submitting DNA profiles from unsolved cases in hopes of finding matches as the database grew. Unbeknownst to investigators in Alaska, Kenneth Dion, a man with a lengthy criminal record, had been arrested and convicted of a series of armed robberies in New Hampshire. As part of his incarceration, Dion's DNA was collected and entered into the database. However, due to bureaucratic delays and backlogs common at the time, his DNA was not uploaded until several years after his conviction. Had Alaska or New Hampshire required DNA collection upon felony arrest rather than post-conviction, and the match might have been made much sooner. In November 2006, a match was finally made. The DNA profile from the semen found on Bonnie Craig's body was linked to Kenneth Dion, then serving time in a New Hampshire prison. The news was both a relief and a shock to Bonnie's family, who had endured 12 years of unanswered questions. Investigators quickly moved to verify the match and build a case against Kenneth. Kenneth was a former Army paratrooper who had been stationed at Fort Richardson in Anchorage during the early 1990s. After leaving the military, he remained in the Anchorage area for several years, accumulating a record of petty theft and assault charges. At the time of Bonnie's murder, Kenneth was living locally, was on probation for robbery, and had recently been released from an Alaskan prison. Investigators reviewed his background and movements around the time of the murder and found that Kenneth had no known connection to Bonnie, and neither her family nor her friends recognized his name or face. When questioned, Kenneth denied knowing Bonnie, but he could not provide a verifiable alibi for the day of her disappearance. His wife, interviewed by authorities, stated that Kenneth had not been home that entire week. The medical examiner concluded that Bonnie's injuries were not consistent with a fall, as Kenneth would later claim, but rather with blunt force trauma from a heavy object or weapon. At the time, Kenneth was known to keep martial arts weapons in his car, any of which could have caused the injuries observed on Bonnie's body. Additionally, a leaf stained with Bonnie's blood was found above the cliff, suggesting she had been wounded before being thrown or falling into the creek. Kenneth's trial officially began in June 2011. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Paul Miovas, opened with a detailed account of the events surrounding Bonnie's disappearance and death. Paul described how on the morning of September 28, 1994, Bonnie left her South Anchorage home around 5 a.m. to walk to a bus stop 2.5 miles away, intending to attend her early class at the University of Alaska Anchorage. She never made it to the bus or her class. Later that afternoon, a hiker discovered her body in McHugh Creek, south of Anchorage. The prosecution's narrative was that Kenneth had abducted, raped, and murdered Bonnie, then attempted to conceal his crime by dumping her body in a remote creek. Prosecutors argued that the claim of consensual sex, which Kenneth's defense would later raise, was entirely unfounded. They pointed out that Bonnie was, quote, hopelessly in love with her long-distance boyfriend at the time and had no known connection to Kenneth. The brutality of the attack, the nature of her injuries, and the circumstances of the crime scene all pointed to a violent assault rather than an accident or a consensual encounter. Kenneth's defense argued that after their supposed consensual encounter, Bonnie tragically fell to her death from the cliff, and Kenneth was not responsible for her murder. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline and to suggest that the physical evidence could be interpreted in a way that did not implicate Kenneth in a premeditated homicide. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. On June 15, 2011, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts, finding Kenneth Dion guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault. The judge agreed with the prosecution, stating that the murder fell into the category of the worst offense under Alaska law. He sentenced Kenneth to 99 years for the murder charge and 25 years for the sexual assault charge, the maximum for each count, to be served consecutively for a total of 124 years in prison. Kenneth, who was 42 years old at the time, continued to deny responsibility for the crime. During sentencing, he interrupted the proceedings to declare that he would never admit guilt because, in his words, he had not committed the crime. Eric and Pam Ellender were a young couple living in Sulphur, Louisiana, a small community in Calcasieu Parish. Eric, 21, worked at a local chemical plant, while Pam, 19, stayed home to care of their 18-month-old daughter Ashley. The couple had married in 1989 and were described by family and friends as loving, responsible, and devoted to their daughter. Their modest single-story home on Shirley Ann Drive was situated in a quiet rural suburban neighborhood, surrounded by pine trees and gravel roads. While the Ellenders were friendly and occasionally hosted friends, they mostly kept to themselves, living a quiet and routine-driven life. On the night of February 10th, 1991, Eric and Pam followed their usual routine. Family members last spoke to them by phone around 9 p.m. and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After putting Ashley to bed in her nursery, which was located directly across the hallway from the master bedroom, the couple retired for the night. Sometime between 1 and 3 a.m., an intruder entered their home. Notably, there were no signs of forced entry. All doors and windows were intact, leading investigators to suspect that the killer either entered through an unlocked door or was familiar with the house and its occupants. The next morning at approximately 11 a.m. on February 11th, Pam's grandmother, Betty Littleton, arrived at the Ellanders' home after being unable to reach them by phone. She found the front door unlocked and entered, immediately sensing that something was wrong due to the unnatural silence. As she walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, she discovered Eric and Pam lying side by side in their bed, partially covered by blankets. Both had suffered head wounds from a 12-gauge shotgun fired at close range. The room was gruesome. Blood spatter covered the walls and ceiling, and the smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Ashley was found in her crib in the nursery, physically unharmed but crying and clearly distressed. Her pajamas and bedding were soiled, a sign that she had been left unattended for many hours. Betty quickly took Ashley outside and called for help, with neighbors soon contacting 911. Law enforcement responded within minutes and began processing the scene as a double homicide. The crime scene itself presented several key observations. Eric and Pam were found on their backs, parallel to each other, with Eric's left arm draped across Pam's torso, suggesting that they were asleep at the time of the attack. Autopsies later revealed that Eric had been shot first, with a single blast to the left temple, and Pam was shot moments later in the right cheek. The force of the shotgun blast was so great that it nearly decapitated her. Pellets and wadding fragments recovered from the bed confirmed that a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with buckshot had been used. Neither victim showed signs of a struggle, and bruising on Eric's knuckles, initially thought to indicate a fight, was later attributed to his manual labor job. Investigators quickly noted that the couple's green 1989 Toyota 4Runner was missing, along with Eric's wallet and Pam's purse. Although a jewelry box in the bedroom appeared to have been rummaged through, it was unclear if anything of value had been taken. Forensic investigators found no usable fingerprints, footprints, or DNA that could be linked to a suspect. The shotgun used in the murders was never recovered, despite extensive searches of nearby canals and wooded areas. The missing vehicle became a critical focus of the investigation. Neighbors reported not hearing gunshots or seeing suspicious activity, but one person did recall seeing headlights leaving the property around 2:30 a.m. 4 days later, the Toyota was found parked outside a motel in Baton Rouge, about 135 miles away. 4 local teenagers, Chris Prudhomme, Robert Adkins, Philip Ledoux, and Kurt Reese, were arrested inside the vehicle during a routine traffic stop. The sheriff's office faced immediate scrutiny for its handling of the case. Chris, the eldest of the 4 suspects, confessed within hours of his arrest, claiming in a videotaped statement that he had acted alone. He described entering the unlocked home, shooting the couple, and fleeing in their vehicle. However, his confession lacked specific details about the home's interior, such as the nursery's location or the arrangement of furniture, which raised doubts about its credibility. Investigators also failed to analyze fingerprints lifted from the Toyota's steering wheel or to examine soil samples from the vehicle's tires, which could have provided valuable information about the suspect's movements. The absence of the murder weapon further complicated efforts to confirm Chris's account. During police interrogation, Chris said the following in regards to the crime. "I went and shot him, I shot the guy, he had a hole in his head. The lady, when she jumped, I shot her too, in the face." He also described stealing the couple's vehicle after the killings. While the confession appeared to provide a swift resolution to the case, it was soon clear that the circumstances surrounding his admission were far from straightforward. The other 3 men arrested with him denied any involvement in the murders. They insisted they had only joined Chris after the fact, for the purpose of joyriding in the stolen vehicle, and were not present at the Ellanders' home during the killings. Despite these denials, all four remained in custody as the investigation continued. In the course of searching Chris's apartment, police found a 12-gauge shotgun freshly sawed off, which was believed to be the murder weapon. This discovery further cemented Chris's status as the primary suspect. However, the details of his confession raised questions. While he claimed sole responsibility, some investigators and family members doubted the full veracity of his account. 17 days after his arrest, Chris was found hanging by the neck in the shower stall of the Calcasieu Parish Jail. He was rushed to the hospital but never regained consciousness, dying a week later after his parents authorized the removal of life support. A handwritten suicide note was discovered in his cell, in which Chris took sole responsibility for the murders and absolved his friends of any involvement. The note was chilling and defiant, stating, "I enjoyed very much in the taking of those two individuals' lives. I don't need society." He also wrote, "The main reason of my death is to hopefully ensure that they receive their freedom." With this note and Chris's death, the sheriff's department declared the case closed. Despite the apparent resolution, significant doubts and suspicions lingered. Pam's father, Huey, a private investigator, was convinced that the truth had not been fully uncovered. He began his own investigation, interviewing over 100 people and uncovering a web of rumors and allegations. He learned that Chris was associated with a group called Skater, which stood for Satan's Kids Against the Establishment. This group was rumored to engage in occult activities and criminal behavior. According to several witnesses Huey interviewed, including girlfriends and acquaintances of group members, Chris was not alone in the Ellanders' home that night. Some claimed that at least one other member of the group participated in the break-in and subsequent murders, and that the original intent was burglary, not homicide. The situation escalated, they said, because the group was high on LSD, leading to the fatal violence. One particularly disturbing allegation came from Nikki Alderson, who told Huey that in the early morning hours after the murders, a party was held at the Ellanders' home by members of the Skater group. She claimed she saw at least a dozen people inside and outside the residence drinking and using drugs, unaware that the bodies of Eric and Pam were still in the house. Other witnesses claimed to have seen videotapes of the party, which allegedly depicted not only the murders, but also the sexual abuse of the victims' bodies. These claims, while sensational, were never corroborated by physical evidence or confirmed by law enforcement, and the existence of such videotapes remains unverified. The confessions and statements of the other suspects added further complexity. Robert Adkins, while out on bail for the theft of the Ellanders' car, allegedly told his friend Sean Moody that he was present during the murders. According to Moody, Adkins said he and Chris broke into the house looking for valuables and found a shotgun. When they entered the master bedroom, Pam awoke, and Chris shot her first, followed by Eric. This account, while implicating Adkins as a witness or participant, still placed Chris as the triggerman. However, other witnesses, including Chip Richard, claimed that Chris was taking the fall for someone else in the group out of loyalty to the cult and his status within it. The ambiguity surrounding these confessions and the lack of physical evidence tying anyone but Chris to the actual murders led to ongoing controversy. Law enforcement, led by Sheriff Wayne McElveen, maintained that the case was solved with Chris's confession and suicide. However, Huey and others believed that a cover-up had taken place, possibly to protect individuals connected to local law enforcement or influential families. There were even rumors that the sheriff's own son, Richard, had been present at the house during the alleged party after the murders, though these claims were never substantiated and were denied by the sheriff, who insisted that Huey had paid witnesses for their testimony. Ultimately, Huey's efforts led to the legal reopening of the case. In a highly unusual move, Huey was allowed to present his findings directly to a grand jury. This process led to the indictment of several individuals who had previously escaped serious charges. One of the most significant developments was the indictment of Kim Manuel. This came after Pearl Fruge, Kim's cousin, secretly recorded a conversation in which Kim discussed details of the murders. On the tape, Kim described the sequence of events but stopped short of admitting to being present during the killings. Nevertheless, the grand jury, after hearing this testimony and the recorded conversation, indicted Kim on 2 counts of second-degree murder. However, the charges against Kim were dropped a year later after her defense argued that the tape had been rehearsed and Pearl's credibility was called into question. The dismissal was without prejudice, meaning Kim could theoretically be charged again, but she never was. The most consequential legal actions, however, came in February 1995, nearly 4 years after the murders. On February 9, 1995, Robert Adkins, Philip Ledoux, and Kurt Reese were indicted in connection with the Ellender murders. These 3 were the other men who had originally been arrested with Chris after being found with the stolen vehicle. Adkins, who was 18 at the time of the murders, faced the most serious charges. Adkins ultimately pled guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent 21-year prison terms for the manslaughter charges and an additional 5 years for auto theft. However, because he had already served time for the auto theft, his manslaughter sentence was reduced to 5.5 years. After his release, Adkins was placed on 5 years probation. Records indicate he had several minor probation violations but received only minor punishments. Philip was convicted as an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 4 years in prison, while Kurt received a 2-year sentence after pleading guilty to being an accessory after the fact. These sentences reflected their alleged roles in assisting after the murders rather than direct participation in the killings themselves. Brooke Baker, born April 24, 1978 in Vincennes, Indiana, was a second-year journalism student at Vincennes University. Described by her brother Braun Baker as headstrong and independent, she approached journalism with a zeal that impressed peers and mentors alike. Her work as editor of The Trailblazer, the university's student newspaper, and her pursuit of high-stakes investigative reporting positioned her as a rising star in collegiate journalism, a trajectory tragically cut short by her murder in 1997. Growing up, Brooke exhibited a natural aptitude for writing and storytelling. Her brother recalled that all of my childhood memories involved her, emphasizing their close bond and shared experiences in their hometown. At VU, she quickly distinguished herself in the journalism program, earning the role of editor at The Trailblazer during her sophomore year. Colleagues and professors noted her ability to balance rigorous reporting with a vibrant social life, often hosting gatherings for the newspaper staff at her off-campus apartment. Michael Mullen, then chair of VU's journalism department, described her as ambitious, fearless, and having a great personality. Rebecca Mullen, an English professor and wife of Michael, noted that Brooke's confidence and charisma left a lasting impression on her daughter Catherine, who admired Brooke's tenacity and wore a ring gifted by her for years after her death. In early 1997, Brooke began investigating an alleged assault involving a member of a campus fraternity. The story centered on a former student who claimed she had been raped by a fraternity member in late 1996 but withdrew from the university afterward due to insufficient institutional support. Brooke's pursuit of this story marked a turning point in her career and her life. She interviewed the alleged victim and documented threats from fraternity members aimed at silencing her. In one instance, a member allegedly told her, "I would be dead if I mentioned the fraternity in any story I was writing." Michael Mullen urged caution and insisted she secure the victim's consent to go public before publishing. Despite these risks, Brooke remained undeterred, viewing the threats as part of being an investigative reporter. Her reporting drew ire beyond the fraternity. Campus police, including her landlord, a part-time officer who owned her off-campus apartment, reportedly harassed her. Brooke told her parents and professors that the officer used his key to enter her apartment unannounced, often chastising her for having male visitors. She filed complaints with campus police about these intrusions and the fraternity's threats, though university officials later denied receiving written report. By August 1997, Brooke's sense of vulnerability intensified. She confided in friends and family about feeling stalked, particularly after her landlord's unwelcome visits and the fraternity's intimidation tactics. Her parents, Tom and Janet Baker, grew increasingly alarmed. Brooke shared emails and notes detailing threats related to her reporting, which her father later stored in a tin box as potential evidence. Despite these pressures, she continued working on the fraternity expose, determined to shed light on systemic failures in addressing campus violence. Fast forward by about a month, on the evening of September 6, 1997, Brooke attended 2 off-campus parties with friends. Those who saw her last described her as being in good spirits, with no indication of unease. She was last seen alive at approximately 1:30 a.m. on September 7th when a friend walked her back to her apartment at 509 Harrison Street, just a short distance from the university campus. The next day, after repeated failed attempts to reach her by phone, Brooke's younger brother Braun became concerned. At around 8:15 p.m. on September 7th, he used his own key to enter her apartment. There, he made the devastating discovery: Brooke's nude body lay face up on her bed, blood soaking the sheets. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but determined that she had already been dead for several hours. The autopsy conducted by Knox County coroner Dr. James Wilson exposed the extent of the violence inflicted upon Brooke. She had suffered 11 deep stab wounds to her back and 1 to her left breast, the latter of which severed her pulmonary artery and caused fatal blood loss. Ligature marks around her neck indicated that her killer had attempted to strangle her, likely in an effort to subdue her before the stabbing. Bruises on her wrists, inner thighs, and elbows pointed to a desperate struggle, suggesting that Brooke fought fiercely against her attacker. The wounds were consistent with the use of a large kitchen knife, and the force applied in the stabbing was described as significant. Notably, the absence of defensive wounds on her hands suggested that her arms had been pinned during the attack, further highlighting the overwhelming violence she endured. The crime scene itself offered several important clues. Investigators found a bent kitchen knife soaked in soapy water in the sink, its blade matching the depth and width of Brooke's wounds. Human tissue on the knife was later confirmed to be hers through DNA analysis. The bathroom was in disarray, with wet towels strewn in an overflowing bathtub, indicating that the killer had attempted to clean up or destroy evidence. There were no signs of forced entry, and all doors and windows were locked, leading detectives to conclude that Brooke likely knew her attacker or had willingly let them in. Her personal belongings, including her purse and cash, were left untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. The most significant forensic evidence came from the semen recovered from Brooke's body, the bed sheets, and beneath her fingernails. This DNA would later become crucial in identifying her killer, though at the time it did not match any profiles in law enforcement databases. One of the first and most scrutinized suspects was Brooke's landlord, Mike Nardine. Brooke had confided in friends, family, and her journalism professor that she felt stalked by Mike, who would enter her apartment unannounced, sometimes using his key without warning. She complained that he watched her through her windows and, in one disturbing allegation, had offered to let her exchange sex for rent. On the night of the murder, Mike was reportedly working on campus not far from Brooke's apartment. Detectives brought Mike in for questioning. He appeared angry and defensive, denying any inappropriate behavior or involvement in Brooke's death. When asked to submit to a polygraph and provide a DNA sample, he agreed, though the polygraph results were inconclusive. His DNA was tested against samples from the crime scene, but the results did not match. Despite the lack of physical evidence tying him to the murder, suspicion lingered due to his access to the apartment and Brooke's documented fears. However, without a DNA match or other corroborating evidence, detectives could not move forward with an arrest. Detectives also looked at Brooke's close circle, including 2 men she had been seeing, Steve and Tommy. Both provided timelines for their whereabouts on the night of the murder, but there were gaps in their alibis that required further investigation. Tommy, for example, said he had been with Brooke at a party and then at her apartment where they had sex before leaving around 1:30 a.m. and crashing at a friend's place. This left a window of time when he was unaccounted for, enough to commit the crime and attempt to clean up the scene. Both men agreed to provide DNA samples, but neither matched the DNA recovered from Brooke's body and crime scene. Another theory that emerged was the possibility that Brooke's killer was a stranger who had responded to an ad she placed in the student newspaper seeking a roommate. Police considered the idea that someone posing as a potential roommate could have gained access to her apartment under false pretenses. However, Brooke's friends said she had received only one response to the ad, and police were unable to identify or locate this individual. With no forced entry and no match for the DNA, the John Doe theory remained speculative and ultimately led nowhere. The investigation also turned toward members of a campus fraternity. Brooke had been working on an expose about an alleged involving a fraternity member, and she had received threats warning her not to pursue the story. Her journalism professor confirmed that Brooke had been threatened by fraternity members, one of whom told her she would be dead if she published anything about the fraternity. The professor walked her to the campus police office to file a report, and Brooke documented the threats in writing. Given the context, police considered the possibility that her murder was an act of retaliation. Approximately 65 fraternity members and other men on campus voluntarily provided DNA samples as part of the investigation. None of these samples matched the DNA found at the crime scene. The fraternity spokesman denied any involvement, and without physical evidence or a DNA match, this line of inquiry was exhausted. Detectives explored every possible angle, including questioning Brooke's cousin, who had lived with her for a time but moved to California a week before the murder. The cousin was reportedly uncooperative and refused to answer investigators' questions, but there was no evidence to suggest involvement. The police also looked into other unsolved murders in the area, including the 1987 killing of another student, Lisa McCracken, whose case bore similarities to Brooke's but had been mishandled and ultimately dismissed due to procedural errors. Then in 1999, the case saw a major breakthrough due to a different case. On July 5th, 1999, Erica Norman was reported missing after failing to attend classes or contact family. Friends last saw her on July 4th at a local bar, the Green Parrot, where she had been drinking and dancing with Brian Jones, a 22-year-old Vincennes resident and VU alumnus. Witnesses reported that Jones offered to drive Norman home, and surveillance footage confirmed the two left together around midnight. 16 days later, on July 20th, a farmer discovered Norman's decomposing body in a plastic storage tub within a cornfield in Lawrence County, Illinois, approximately 30 miles from Vincennes. An autopsy revealed she had been assaulted, strangled, and stabbed multiple times in the back. Crime scene investigators noted disturbing parallels to Brooke Baker's murder: towels soaked in an overflowing bathtub, a kitchen sink filled with soapy water, and attempts to cleanse the scene with bleach. Investigators, led by Detective John Winkler, immediately recognized the similarities between Norman's murder and Brooke's unsolved case. Both victims were VU students living in off-campus housing. Both had been stabbed repeatedly in the back, and both crime scenes showed evidence of meticulous cleanup efforts. Most critically, recovered from Norman's body provided a DNA profile that matched the unidentified sample from Brooke's 1997 murder. Investigators traced the DNA to Brian Jones after learning he had interacted with Norman shortly before her disappearance. When questioned, Jones claimed he had accompanied Norman to her apartment to watch a movie but left after she fell asleep on the couch. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample and allowed police to search his car and home. Forensic analysis revealed Norman's blood on the floor mats of Jones's car and on a pair of shoes he owned. The DNA from both crime scenes confirmed Jones as the perpetrator in both cases. Although he had no direct relationship with Brooke, Jones had attended a fraternity party near her apartment on September 6, 1997, and was seen leaving around 2 a.m., which was within the time frame of her murder. During initial interviews in 1997, Jones denied knowing Brooke intimately, but as previously mentioned, DNA evidence proved otherwise. Investigators also uncovered another chilling detail. Jones had rented the 1996 film Curdled, a crime thriller depicting a murder nearly identical to Brooke's, weeks before her death. In the film, a killer stabs a victim multiple times in the back, cleans the knife in a sink, and disposes of bloody towels in a bathtub. Prosecutors argued this influenced Jones's modus operandi, citing the soapy knife found in Brooke's sink and the towels in her bathtub as direct parallels. Facing overwhelming evidence in Norman's case, Jones pleaded guilty to her murder in August 2000 as part of a plea agreement that spared him the death penalty. He received a 60-year sentence for Norman's murder, but maintained his innocence in Brooke's case. The defense argued the DNA only proved contact, not murder, and challenged the timeline. However, the jury convicted Jones after 6 days of deliberation. Judge Tim Crowley sentenced him to life in prison without parole, citing the heinous nature of the crime and Jones's lack of remorse.